Let's talk about maps for a minute, because everybody seems to get into maps. Indian maps, Spanish maps, there's all kinds of maps out there, or at least claims of maps. We looked at some down along the bottom of Steinecker yesterday and photographed what we call a map rock. And it could be anything, in my opinion. We called it, when we were kids, map rock, because it looked like maybe it's a rock. In my opinion, a lot of the things that come out on the internet, people saying, here's a map and here's another one, that a lot of those are not maps, in my opinion. And again, my opinion doesn't mean anything, but there's nothing to me that shows you. And so I'm going to, by the way, I didn't tell you, but there's going to be tests in this thing tonight. And it's not just at the end. We're going to do them as we go along. So my first question tonight is, what would you make a map for? If you were the one drawing the map, what would you draw a map for?
Somebody else.
Okay, to get from point A to point B, that might be one reason. What else would you draw a map?
Show somebody else how to get to point A to point B.
All right, so somebody else can come back to at least to point B. They need to get where you've got, and what's going to be at point B? Why are you trying to get them back? Gold? What kind of gold? Okay, if we're talking about gold and we're getting you back to gold, what's the gold there for? What kind of gold are we looking for? Mine, maybe, a gold mine. What else? A stash? A church treasure? What else? Anything else you can think of? And why, if you were the person trying to get yourself or somebody else back to the gold, why did you leave this huge stash of gold? Why didn't you take it with you? Or why didn't you come back and get it? Are you seeing what I'm starting to talk about? Why are you doing these things? And then you get into some of the books, and I'm not going to name anybody's names and get back to them, and they'll all hate my guts before I even publish a book. But they say, okay, now, the Spanish are coming back here to get their stash of gold or to get to their mines or whatever, or maybe get a family member there. And at the very end, now remember, we're starting in the Gulf of Mexico, for example. And we're going to go from there, and we've got to get up here into the Uintas to get to our stash or our gold mine. You're going to have a hard time finding the state of Utah. Okay, you're walking, you haven't got good maps, you might be on some trails or something, but we're trying, first of all, to find the state of Utah. Then you're trying to get in the right area in the state of Utah. And finally, you're trying to get to the final few feet. And maybe there's some markers of kinds. Maybe there's some big ones carved. Maybe you're seeing some symbols in a tree. Maybe these things are getting you close. And now you get within a few hundred yards, and all of a sudden you need to have a transit, and you need to turn 200 angles off from different rocks and that to get you right to the shaft that you need to be in. To me, that's stupid. Why have you got to do that? Who's here that's going to get you gold if you don't turn 200 angles with your transit at the end? You've got natives that are animals, that they're slaving to death in the mines, that don't know anything, and who else is going to get your gold or whatever without you being able to use all these mean triangles and all these things they're doing? To me, that's stupid, and there's a lot of other things that tie in with that that don't make any sense at all to me. Now, you may be trying to get yourself back. Those of you that went to the sink today with us, I hadn't been there since 1970, and it's been a little bit hard for me to remember how to get you there. If you're coming back from the Gulf of Mexico, even if it's you coming back, you may still need a map yourself. And on top of that, the King of Spain, if you're Spanish, guess what? You're required by law to be drawing the maps. You've got to draw the maps. You've got to keep the daily journals. You've got to do all these things. And so you're required to do something. But guess what? They're putting your maps in the archives so that your next door neighbor can go in there and get hold of the maps and probably go into your same mines, although those are the ones that are registered with the king. And if they're not, then you can keep it secret for you or your family. If there's the massacres that took place, and by the way, somebody, I can't remember who, asked me today what I thought about whether there was maybe a 100-year gap. The Spanish came in for a while, and then there was a period of time when it appeared that they weren't in here, and then they were again, and asked what I thought about that. You got to keep in mind that a lot of the Spanish mines were hidden. If you were Indians, and they killed thousands of them in the mines, and what was the vet? I'm going to be maybe get off track a little bit. You guys bring me back if I get off too far. What was the value of gold to the Indians? How did the Spanish find the gold in the Uintas? How did they get it here in the Uintas? There's a couple of methods. Here's another test question. How did they find the gold in the Uintas?
From the Indians.
Test the river.
Okay, from the Indians was a big one. They came in and they got it from the Indians. Now, what were the Indians doing with gold? What was the value to the Indians?
Ceremony.
Ceremony. And that's it. They didn't trade gold or anything. They used it in sacred ceremonies. And so typically it wasn't the whole tribe knew about it. It was a shame. Where did they find they had gold here in the Uintas? How did they know the Indians knew where there was gold? I'll tell you one way, and it's not just the Utes, but the Utes were one of them, and they still do it today. If you're a Ute Indian, full-blood Indian, and you go through the exercise of becoming a brave when you reach age, you go through a ceremony that takes days, and at the end of that ceremony, you have a leather thong around your neck, and you have a leather pouch that goes so nobody can see it inside your shirt. There's a number of sacred items in that, and you wear that all the time. 2 of the items in that pouch are gold nuggets, part of a sacred ceremony, coming of age. And you won't get too many people to talk to you about it. I have got people to talk to me about it that have gone through that ceremony, and I've asked them what's in the pouch, and they told me we can't tell you. It's all sacred stuff. But I asked a specific question because I had already done some research and thought I knew the answer. I said, is it true that you have 2 gold nuggets in there? And they told me, yes, it is true. And so they have gold nuggets in there. So when the Spanish come in, and if you have some skirmishes and you kill some of them, and guess what? They've got a pouch around their neck. What's in the pouch? You open it up, there's a couple of gold nuggets. Hey, I wonder if all of them have that. Kill another one and look. Sure enough, he's got 2 gold nuggets around his neck. This is pretty cool. All these Indians have gold. So you go ask them, where'd you get your gold? I don't know. Shaman, gave it to me when I became a brave. So how do you find out? How do you find out where they're getting the gold nuggets from? You catch him and you torture the shaman or whatever until he tells you. And then you go to their sacred gold mines. It's just typically mined by the shaman and that to get things. And they use gold, by the way, for a couple of other ceremonies too, but that was one of their main ones. And then, guess how you mine the gold?
Use the Indians.
The Spanish had named a month of the year for gathering slaves. It would be like us taking July and instead of naming it July, say, okay, this is gather your slave month. So it would be January, February, March, April, gather your slave months, whatever. And it happened to be in the early spring. And so what would happen is, all right, all winter, you've been surviving off dried meat and so forth. And in the early spring, they would be so weak from malnutrition and so forth that they could ride a few Spaniards into their tribal area and gather a whole bunch of them up, and they didn't even have enough strength to defend themselves. Then you'd go feed them for a few weeks, get their strength back, and you'd run them off to the mines. I've had people that were raised by the Utes that told me stories about some of these mines in the mountains. When you mine it, you have to get your ore down to your smelter. And if your mine's way up on the mountain and your smelter's down by the creek 2 miles away or whatever, how are you going to get that down there? Well, now sometimes they take it in carts, but you try bringing a cart down off one of these mountains right here, you got to have a road of some kind. And so that it was nothing to hook 200 Indians up to, they made road graders. And instead of horses or whatever, you'd hook 200 slaves up to that, and you'd grade roads in the mountains. And you can still find their roads in Rock Creek and different areas in the mountains, and then they'd bring their carts down. Now, their carts were English-style carts, and they had a narrower wheelbase between their wheels and that, but you can still find them. We'll talk about that a little bit. I've been able to see some of their trails. I can tell you different areas in the state where the trails are still really easily seen. But anyway, so now we found out how they get part of the gold. They did have other methods of finding gold, and how did that work? Any of you have any idea how the Spanish found their gold besides?
Test the river. Placer gold.
Okay, placer gold, they could check the rivers. Spaniards were great miners. It wasn't just that they tortured Indians to find out, and so they knew several methods. Another method they used all the time.
Dowsing.
Dowsing, that's what I was just going to say. And so they were great dowsers, and we have a lot of prints done on wood stamp prints that show the Spaniards mining in the mountains, and it shows when they dowsed, they had to have 2 people to dowse for minerals, not one, like we do nowadays, dowsers. They used 2, and they used what they called Spanish needles, and you would stand facing each other with 4 needles. Each person would hold 2 of what they called needles, and the best way to describe them is miniatures of when you watch your Christmas special of Scrooge, and remember the little crippled boy having one of the old-fashioned crutches that comes up and it's made out of a tree limb, and then it's got part of the limb goes around in a U shape under his arm. That's what they looked like, but they were very short, and you would hold them and lock those U's together, and then those would control, and so it take two people to dowse, and they were very good at that. Another method they would use, there was actually a lot of things more than just dowsing, and French were better at it than the Spaniards, but the Spaniards did other things too, and you could, people who specialized in finding the material, one of the books, or I guess I'll call it a pamphlet, that I studied for years, and I've still only found parts of it translated into English, written back in the 1600s by Minister of Minerals in France. It was a woman, and she had, I think it was 19 things she would do, and she could find any kind of mineral they wanted. So the king would come and say, we need lead, or we need zinc, or we need gold, or we need whatever. And she would go out and go through these 19 methods. Dowsing was one of them. You would taste groundwater, so you would dip out of little puddles of water and taste it. Plant life was another one. There was a whole series of things that they would look at, and she could easily go find any kind of mineral she wanted. She published that in a book, how to do all those things in the early, I think it was the 15 or 1600s, I believe. And it was several pages. It would be like 20 pages or something, and told how all the methods that you had to use to find minerals. Well, the Spaniards used a lot of those, and so they could find gold. It wasn't just the Indians, but that's the easiest way to do it. Why go out there and tromp around on the mountain looking for a vein or something when you can just torture somebody to tell me where they're getting theirs? And so that's how we got a lot of the mines and so forth. Now, if they're slaving you in the mines, and they literally, if you read some of the books on Cornar's children, for example, and some of those, you'll find that they slaved to death about 50% of the Indian population, North and South America. They slaved them to death. I mean, we're talking hundreds and hundreds of thousands were slaved to death in these mines and so forth. And so we're talking large numbers. Now, why do the Indians still protect it? And first of all, do you think it's protected by the Indians? Do you think they watch these locations?
Yes.
Big time. And it hasn't been very long ago. In fact, I can tell you that a couple of years ago I was taken off-road in Rock Canyon by someone who could take me off-road without us going to jail or whatever. And we spent an entire day looking at a lot of Spanish stuff, mostly Spanish stuff, although we looked at some sacred burial grounds. We looked at 2 man-made huge mounds, and the man-made mounds, my question was, well, what are they making that for? You know, they used to do big burial mounds. I was wondering if it was a burial mound or something. They said, no, it's not a burial mound. There was 2 of them close together. and they told me, they said, that's where we bury our story sticks. And I said, story sticks? What's a story stick? I says, are you talking something? Now, I went on an LDS mission to Alaska, British Columbia, and I've lived in Alaska, met my wife in the Yukon Territories. So I've been up north quite a bit along the coast, and I've gone and watched them make totem poles and so forth. And I says, are you talking like a totem pole? And they says, yeah, like a totem pole. They says, we have wooden carvings. They bury them in the mounds that tell the entire history of the Ute tribe. And they're very sacred to them. And so that was one of the things I was shown. And after we looked at things all day long, And I was taken right to mines. I was taken right to trails. I was shown where a lot of gold was buried, in raw gold, flake, cast in bars and so forth, and shown where a lot of it was. And by the way, I asked a story right after we'd had lunch, and I'll tell you some other things that happened as we go along. But right after we had lunch, I made the comment. I said, I've got a pretty good collection of books and Utah things. I says, I've got 3 published books by 3 different authors that all claim they've been inside what they call Kerry Chenal. And I said, all of them describe Kerry Chenal inside, and all of them are very different in their description. And I says, in my opinion, if any of the 3 have been in, only one could have been inside because of their descriptions. And I asked him, I said, are you familiar with the books? And I was told, yes, I've read all 3 of them. And I said, do you think any of these 3 guys have been inside this mine? And they said, none of them have. And I said, how do you know? And he said, because I've been inside and know what it looks like. And then he told me, he says, all the things I've told you this morning, all the things I'll show you and tell you this afternoon, the only thing I can't talk to you about is that particular mine because I've promised tribal elders I won't talk about it. And I said, that's fine with me. I don't want to create any kind of problems or anything. And so I just left it alone. And I had a GPS unit with me, and I had my camera with me all day. And I didn't dare take a picture. I didn't dare take my GPS out because I figured as soon as I took a photograph or a GPS reading, that would be done. And so later on in the day, we're driving up the road, and he says, you see those cliffs up there? And I says, yeah. And he says, that's where it's at. But now I got to back up a little bit. We're talking Kerry Chenal, and there's books with that title and so forth, and out on the different web pages, they argue back and forth whether it really exists, how they came up with the name, if it really exists, all those kind of things. What I was told is there is no such thing. Kerry Chenal does not exist as a name. That was invented by white people to go with books and stories. And so I still use it for people in place of the best sacred mine. And there were several sacred mines. Back years ago when I first got interested in this stuff, they used to fight over whether there was 1 sacred mine, 2 sacred mines, or 3 sacred mines, and whether they were in Rock Creek or whether they were in White Rocks Canyon, or potentially both. I was always of the opinion there was more than 1. Now it's real obvious that there's more than 1. In fact, there's several of them, sacred mines. Some are way better than others, but the one everybody calls Kerry Chenal is just a better mine than the other ones. It's still a sacred mine, and it's in Rock Creek, according to the people that told me. And so, now, that being said, after a while here, I may have to get my notes if my wife knows me pretty good. She says everybody's going to have to drag me off. I'm so full of hot air. We'll just go as long as everybody wants to. But that being said, let's talk a little bit about White Rocks. And keep in mind, if you got questions as we go along. I knew it. I'll come over here because I was always taught that smoke follows beauty, but just wondered when it was going to happen. But anyway, so I'll talk a little bit about Rock Creek Canyon. I'll talk a little bit about White Rock. We'll talk about Moon Lake and some other places. Talk a little bit about this area. Some of us were up a little bit earlier with Dale, and for those of you who weren't there, maybe we'll start here and head that direction. There are a number of canyons. I've never been up, but a lot of the Spanish people go up, and there is a lot of different mines and so forth, but I haven't been in some of those. So up this canyon, Dale showed us some different symbols and that, and I have a little bit of problem with, well, not a little bit, I have quite a bit of problem with symbols. I've got some of the books that have been out of print for a long time, and some of them that were printed in limited numbers and so forth, and are real hard to come by. And a lot of them that show different symbols and tell you what the different meaning is. And I've tried to talk to some of the different authors and find out, now, where did you get your information from? Where did you find out what this particular symbol means and all those kind of things? And I haven't ever got a really good answer from anybody. Not that there isn't something out there, but I wonder how much of it's imaginary or what you'd like it to mean or all those kinds of things versus, if somebody got something out of Seville, Spain or something. So I have a little bit of difficulty with it. I've got a friend who isn't real well known out there, but he's published 27 treasure books. He lives here in Utah. He's published one on Utah, 27 on different states, and he's publishing treasure books for every state in the union. He's got 3 more ready to publish right now. Some have been out for quite a while. He goes under a fake name, and I never figured out exactly why that is, but I was talking to him not too long ago, and he said that he's got, by far, the biggest collection of symbols and their meanings, way more than any of the books, if you combined all of them in the state of Utah. And I've got to sit down with him and ask him where he got his information, see if I can get a copy of his book, if it looks like it's worthwhile. But so we always have the symbols, potentially, and are they going to lead us to a treasure? And if so, how do you read them and all those kinds of things? And Martinall's book is a big Indian book, and I've had that longer than probably most of the people in the state of Utah, and I read through half of it, thought it was wonderful, got about halfway through and figured he was taking too many drugs or something. All of a sudden went way out in left field, and I quit studying that one. If I go back to it, I just reference the first half of it, where it seems like he's making reason and so forth. But there, and everybody just uses that one book. Well, there's a lot of books out there that were written back in the 1800s, or quite a few of them in that, where the guys actually were living with the Indians, and the Indians were teaching them symbols. And so you go in, and I've got a collection of a lot of those books, and they tell you different tribes. I've got one on reading Sioux and Chippewa and several of the different languages and so forth. And so you can get a lot of information, and you can kind of blend some of it together. We get into, I know one of Terry's favorite ones is, they call them the mystery glyphs, and I don't know if that was a term that you came up with.
Yeah.
Okay, and they're fascinating to look at, and I've looked at a number of them, mostly within the state of Utah, but I've looked at Terry's information out there and so forth, and some of the mystery glyphs, as they call them, I've looked at them and thought, well, a lot of these symbols are in some of the books I've got on Chippewa and Sioux language and different things, and it's not just one, it's a combination, and then you get some that look like they're Mayan in there and different things. So whoever was writing those had a combination of understanding and a mixture of several of these, and you run into the same thing when you get into when we find old Spanish. You get into the old Spanish is very different from the new Spanish. Sometimes that's hard to understand. You've got Reformed Egyptian. I always thought Reformed Egyptian, being raised as a Mormon, they said, okay, the Book of Mormon's written in Reformed Egyptian, and I thought we're talking about some mixture, maybe all crammed together to come up with some new language that we're going to call Reformed Egyptian. It's not Egyptian anymore. There's enough differences to it, Reformed, and I just recently in my studies have figured out what Reformed Egyptian really is, because all it is Egyptian, and any other language has certain things they talk about, and if you talk about something that's not in your language, it's not known. For example, if you talk about Christ or Christian religion or whatever it is you're going to talk about, if that's not in their language, they don't have symbols or words for it. And so you have to be able to describe that in a roundabout fashion. And when you're talking about that in a language that doesn't have that in their symbols and language, now we're talking a reformed language. You're talking about things that were never in your language. Okay, and so we get reformed languages where they're just trying to figure out a way to get in their writing to tell you something. And it's not in their language. And so now we've scattered all over the place. All right, let's talk. So up here above us, and in this immediate area, and I'll tell you a few things that I can't take you to some of the locations yet. I don't know where some of them are yet. I do have people who told me they're going to take me in close to this area. I've got someone who fairly recently they found a vertical shaft. It's got a chicken ladder in it. Does everybody know what a chicken ladder is? Anybody who doesn't know what a chicken ladder is? Okay, so it's got a chicken ladder coming out the top. It's got Caleb Rhodes' initials carved in the top of the chicken ladder. And very close to the entrance is a cannon still. Okay, that's just been found in the last couple of years. And I've got someone, we actually came out to Vernal a couple of years ago and had arranged to go see it. And he got called off on emergency at work, and we weren't able to go. But I've talked to him a number of times since. He says, yeah, you come out anytime and I'll take time off work or whatever and I'll go in and look at it. Haven't been in to see it yet, but that's in this approximate area. Those that went with us today up and saw the red painting on the rock, and I told you it shows a stick figure, and he's got 5 fingers on one hand and it looks like 3 fingers on the other hand. The 3 fingers, I've been told by people, and again, whether they really know what they're talking about, the 3 fingers is actually a pistol. It's a Spaniard holding a pistol in his hand, and there's some chicken feet or bird feet and bear paws, things like that. Now, the story that I tell is when I was shown that back in the 60s, we didn't see that same rock back then to start with. It was further up towards where we went to look at that big scene. And there was a rock up there that had a Spanish map painted on it. And it had a bunch of drainages shown and had some symbols for treasure and gold and stuff. And so I photographed that quite a bit back in the 60s. And then I went a lot of years without going up there. And I had some friends that wanted to see it. And so we went up there several years ago. And I walked them right down to where the rock had been. And the rock's got to weigh 50 to 100 tons. I mean, a huge rock. And the rock's gone. I have no idea how somebody moved it or whatever. We went across the road. We looked to see if somebody had gone up and improving the road, because it's right alongside the road like that other one was. See if they'd blasted it into pieces or something. See if we could find some kind of remnants of it. Never could find anything. In the process of looking for the original, which I'd photographed, and that we went down the road, and at that point we found the one with the bear paw and the stick figure and all those kind of things. Now, to tie that in a little bit more and tell you some more about Spanish stuff up through that canyon, and for those of you that didn't know, if you go down the road here from our campground until you hit the Red Cloud Loop Road where it forks and you come up here, you start up around the mountain, and we're talking the next 3 or 4 miles up that road. There's a lot of Spanish stuff right in there. And so some of it, I'll tell you a couple of stories, and I think most of this ties in with this. So, one of the families from Vernal, there was a man who, quite a few years ago, went on an LDS mission down to Mexico. And they're doing what we call tracking. For those of you who may not know what that is, may not be LDS, when you're a missionary, you go around, and what a lot of missionaries do for a big part of their mission is you go around knocking on doors. So you go down the street knocking on all the doors and asking if people are interested in hearing about the church or whatever. And so they were doing that. Well, they came to a house, and there was a lady that was over 100 years old sitting out on the porch in a rocking chair. And she didn't want anything to do with them. But in a little bit of conversation they had, this man from Vernal mentioned that he was from Vernal and the Uinta Basin and a bunch of stuff. And she got kind of excited about the whole thing and asked him to sit down and talk to her. And so she told the story that when she was only about 5 or 6 years old, that she had been up in the basin area here, and with her family, an extended family, there was uncles and aunts and family and so forth, and they had a gold mine that was quite rich and that they were working. And when she was just this real young age, her uncle had taken her with by horseback, and they went for a picnic or something, went further up the canyon. And so when they got up the canyon and had their picnic or whatever, and they came back down to the mine where all the families worked in that, and everybody was dead. They'd been slaughtered. They were laying around on the ground and so forth. And nobody was there at the time, but somebody had killed all of them, and they didn't stop. They didn't go back to their camp to pick up stuff or anything. They continued on by horseback, went down into Mexico, and she'd never been back since. And so she told this guy where the gold mine was, and everything she could remember as a young girl. And she says it's this canyon, and she started telling him ways to find it. Well, there's that stream that runs across there, and she says there's a smelter there in the stream. And when you find that, she told him how to go from that direction, go up the side of the hill to find the shaft for the gold mine and so forth. Well, he was raised here in the Vernal area, and he's probably 20 years old now. And so he's fairly familiar with these canyons here. And so he says, well, I know about where that's at. And so every time he'd get a chance, whether it was vacation, deer hunt, whatever, he'd come up in that area and he would look for this smelter first thing. And the smelter's real hard to see because it's built into the side of the creek and it's covered with moss and that, because all that's left is some of the rock work and that you can recognize if you can see it, but it's kind of camouflaged with the moss. So if you walk that 3-mile stretch, you got to look against the bank and look for a man-made part of a smelter. Well, he finally found that. It took him years to find that. And he finally found the smelter, and so then he knew about where to go up the side of the mountain to find the gold mine. So he started going up looking for the gold mine. And he looked for it for several years. And he finally found it. The reason it'd been so hard to find was a great big tree had fallen down, and a great big limb had gone right in the shaft. And so it was just about totally camouflaged to the point you couldn't see it. He finally was able to find that. And so at that point, he's getting old enough, and he's got 2 other buddies that go out in the mountains doing quite a bit of stuff. And so they're 3 partners. And so they ended up having the Colorado School of Mining come out, University of Utah came out, geology department. They did core drillings and everything. And they came back to these 3 older gentlemen that got a claim on the mine. And they told them the mine is very rich in gold. It goes back in a long ways, and it's got a lot of gold in it. They says it's going to cost you about $3 million to develop the mine. Well, in mining terms, $3 million is nothing, but to most of us, $3 million is quite a bit of money. And it scared these 3 guys, and they never did anything with it. And they tried to keep claims up in that, but you got to continually do work and all these things. Eventually, they lost their claims, and other people came in behind them and claimed it. Well, up until a couple of years ago, they had at least one gentleman up there, and he's trying to get back in and develop it and so forth, and he has compressors and all the typical mining stuff down there, but he's doing it like on a one-man operation. But that's all shut down even in the last couple of years. But I suspect somebody's still got a claim on it. But kind of expensive to develop some of these mines, but that's one of them. Not far from here. It's, in fact, we were passing it going up, looking at stuff today, and that it's on the side of the mountain up there, and there's a smelter that goes with it and so forth. Mine of the Lost Souls, they talked about on that one, and maybe a lot of you have heard about it, but heading up this canyon here, and you go up not very far, and you get into, and there's Massey Caves on the side of the hill there. Well, Earl Massey, who's one of the Masseys that owned this as a ranch, all of it was a ranch at one time. He and I did some work 30 years ago or so. We built the McDonald's down in Vernal and together in that before he died and so forth. And I talked to him quite a bit about the ranch up here. Well, back in about probably the 40s or something, somewhere thereabouts, the caves at that point, one of the big caves was a lot bigger than the one that you can go in up there now, and some of you went back in that quite a ways. But there was one much bigger than that, and a young lady died or got hurt or something, and the National Guard came up and blew that all up and sealed it and everything. Now you can still go in the one smaller one, and you see a lot of the smaller ones up in the same area. Well, the story that goes with that is common to quite a few stories that you hear across the Uintas here and so forth, and that is you hear about whenever they could, the Indians, if they could kill the Spaniards, they would. Now, typically, there might be 100, 200 Indians on a mine site, and there might only be half a dozen Spaniards. Well, how do you keep track of them? Okay, here's another test. How does half a dozen Spaniards take care of 200 Indians, slaving them? What's that?
Hostages, bottleneck.
Okay, there could be all kinds of things, but one of the big items is the 200 Indians don't have any kind of weapons other than a stick or a rock, and what do the Spaniards got? They've got guns, they've got cannons, they've got blunderbusses, they've got pistols, and so forth. And by the way, one of the ways that helped convince the Indians, this was another thing I was told when we went off road in Rock Creek. There's a hillside or a hill in there that looks like a giant ant bin. It goes up quite a bit off the valley floor, and it's just a conical thing that comes up. And Indians still today call that Boom Hill. They had a great big cannon up on top of it. Whenever they'd see Indians traveling through there, they would shoot this cannon off, and it would echo all through Rock Canyon. And all that's doing is telling them, hey, don't mess with us. We've got these guns and that. We can wipe out a bunch of it with our weapons and so forth. And so they could keep track of these Indians. Well, they'd always have cannons and that up on the these mine sites and so forth. And when the Indians would get an organized rebellion together and say, okay, we're gonna rebel, we're gonna kill the Spaniards, the cannons by far were the biggest threat to them. So what do you do with the biggest threat? You take it out, very first thing. So when it's planned and they're not expecting it, you rush the cannons, you're up in the mountains or something, and how do you get rid of a cannon real quick?
Push it down.
You push it down, roll it down off where it's at down, and so when you go looking for Spanish cannons, where do you find them? You find them down in the bottom, because they've all been rolled. If they're not in the bottom, they went back to Mexico with the Spaniards or whatever. The ones you're going to find are the ones down at the bottom of the drainages that they rolled off, eliminated the cannons, and now is what you've got is a single-shot pistol or rifle against 200 Indians. You rush them, maybe a few of the Indians die, and guess what happens to the Spaniards? We're going to kill them all, and so then what? Now, if you're one of the Indians, keep in mind, and this is what I typically try to do all the time, and why I question a lot of what people say. I try to put myself in different positions. Put yourself in the position of a enslaved Indian that's being enslaved to death. And by the way, they'd do things like if you lost a pack of ore coming out up these chicken ladders, and you had a sack made out of leather and that, and a strap that would go around your head and carry your ore down your back and so forth. And if you're coming up and they're running you for a 16-hour day carrying these heavy pack loads, and if you drop one sack load of ore, guess what? You get a second shift without any rest in between. Those kind of things. And then if you try to run away, guess what they do to you? They cut all the tendons in the back of your legs and that, so you can't walk anymore, so you can't get away, and you do other things. You might crush it with mercury or something, and you're going to die of mercury poisoning soon, or all those kind of things. But they did terrible, cruel things to them all the time. So here you are, you're a slave, you're an animal, literally. That's what they look at you as an animal. Their religion, you had to be baptized, so they would baptize. You'd be forced into baptism. You were considered an animal that could be worked to death, literally, or killed, or anything else if you got out of line with no problem whatsoever. And so they hated them with a passion. And so when they'd have their rebellions and they'd roll the cannons off and they'd kill them, they knew about their religion. You were forced into their religion, and part of the religion was, and I hope I'm not hurting anybody's feelings particularly, but part of that religion was if you don't get your last rites as you're dying or when you're dead, what happens to you? Purgatory forever. Forever. Okay? So, if you hate somebody really bad and you really want to do something bad to them, what do? To get your last rites, your body has to be there. So, let's hide your body. Family knows you're over there somewhere, but you don't come back after that season or whatever. And that they may send people out looking for you because they're concerned about you, and eventually they're going to come to the conclusion that you're dead. But if we can't find your body, you're going to purgatory for eternity. There's nothing worse that they could do. And so where do they hide your body? They put it in the mine, number one, Because guess what? If you kill everybody and they bring another group in next year, what are they going to do? They're going to round you up as slaves again, put you back in the same mines. Best way to make sure you're not a slave is if there's no mines to work in. And so they throw you in the mine, and they bury the mine up and erase everything they can so you can't find the mine again. If the mine can't be found, they can't slave you. And not only you, but also your family knows that you're going to purgatory for eternity. And so that's why so many of them are hidden and so hard to find. The ones that you find, majority of the ones you find, if they have an attempt to hide them, are ones that are worked out. So you can find the mines, you go in, there's no more ore body, or very little. And so those are the ones that are easier to find. The ones that get found that are in good shape are either because of a map or a symbol or a slight cave-in, because they buried them up, it caves in a little bit, and you find a little bit of an entrance, you shimmy in on your belly and find there's a mine, dig it out. Those kind of things. Those are the good mines. The bad ones are the ones you find that are open up. No big deal, because you're not going to come back to a mine that doesn't have ore in it anymore. And so these are some of the things that are happening with the Spaniards and the Indians in the area. So we have, along with this gold mine up here, a little bit further up, there's 6 Spanish graves, probably related to the Spanish gold mine I was talking about. They had 2 trees with each grave. One tree had a star carved on it, one had a cross carved on it for each grave of the 6 graves. Other than that, I'm trying to think what else is right in that area. We also have the Mine of the Lost Souls. Now, we were getting into the Mine of the Lost Souls and the fact that they would kill you, throw you in, and eliminate it. Now, the Mine of the Lost Souls has quite a bit of information on it, and is what happened. It's a silver mine up here, and it was a real rich silver mine. The Spanish were working it according to all the archives and everything. The Spaniards lived in all those little all those little caves in that you see up in that area. That's where they lived. They worked the mine up in that area. The reason we know it's up in that area is because they give you a bunch of information on the mine and out of the archives, and some of the information is there's a natural arch. Did any of you go up and see a natural arch? There's a natural arch up there. They talk about the river comes down and goes into the ground and comes up further down. Did any of you go clear to the end of the road up this way? What was at the end of the road in the river? You basically ran right up against the river, and that was the end of the road. You have to turn around and come back. What was happening with the river up there? There's water running in. What's happening down here a little further? It's dry as a bone, and it is for a long ways down the canyon, 12 miles or something like that, that it goes underground and then it comes back up. Are those unusual features? And there are other features. They all match right up there around Massacre Cave. That's why everybody thinks that's where Mine of Lost Souls is. But it was another one of the situations where the Indians killed them all, threw them in the mine, buried the mine. And so unless you can figure out by dowsing or by a little bit of a cave-in or something where it's at, you might walk right over the top of it up there and never find it. But there is a really good silver mine right up in that area. It's Spanish. If you're able to find it and get in, you'll find all the bodies of the dead Spaniards. So is there, if you were to continue around Red Cloud Loop, and for those of you especially from Vernal, you'll know, here's your next question. If you continue up here, where do you end up? Where does Red Cloud Loop go? None of you know? Somebody don't know. Well, you come out on the highway going up to Flaming Gorge, don't you? Quite a ways up on the mountain, but you'll come out on the highway going up to Flaming Gorge. Well, part of that around there, and we'll talk about a little bit more that way before we start moving to the west. So if you're going up the paved highway to Flaming Gorge out of Vernal, or if you're going around Red Cloud Loop, there's two caves up there that are quite well known and pretty popular. One's called Big Brush Creek Cave, one's called Little Brush Creek Cave. They both go a long ways, and some of them have been partially mapped. Neither one of them have been fully mapped. But let's see, Paul, is it Big Brush Creek Cave that's around Red Cloud Loop? Or is
So,
that
yes.
Little Brush Creek?
No big.
It's big?
Yeah.
Okay, so Big Brush Creek Cave is you park right on Red Cloud Loop, and then you have to hike down into it. And it's huge. It's got the entrance to that thing is as tall as these trees probably, and it's 100 feet, probably more than that, probably a couple hundred feet across on the entrance. And you go in, and a lot of people go back, and there's three great big caverns, and it's big and smaller and big and smaller and big and smaller. And then they think they've done the whole thing, and they come out. Well, there's lots of little shafts that take off from it, and they'll open back up, and there's underground rivers, and there's all kinds of things in there. And you can probably go miles in there in these caves. Well, the cave itself, I know they found some Indian stuff in, and years ago, coming down the path off Red Cloud Loop to get to it, it's like a well-beaten cattle path. There's been enough kids and that going down there to go in the cave. I was going down there, probably been 20, 30 years ago, and I was taking a bunch of people, and they were all ahead of me, and I was walking right this path that's beaten down in the ground about 6 or 8 inches, and it looked like there was a piece of orange plastic about the color of a creamsicle right in the middle of the trail. And I typically will pack out a little bit more than I pack in type of thing, and I thought, okay, here's a chunk of plastic. I'm going to just pick it up, put it in my pocket, and I'll carry that out of here. And so I picked it up. Guess what? It wasn't a piece of plastic. It was a real nice Indian artifact. And it probably been walked on 1,000 times. It was right in the middle of the trail, and it was like fluorescent orange and dirt like this, and nobody bothered to pick it up or look at it. And it was a perfect Indian artifact, a real nice one. And so the Indians used the cave somewhat. At one time, when I was young, it used to have what's called a venturi into it, which means that air would move from the meadow up above it down in some certain way, and they use venturis and that in industry and that nowadays. Shoot compressed air in, and hot air comes out one side, and really cold air comes out the other. They use it in a lot of space things. They use it in high-speed drills and things. And the venturi made it so that there was big ice fields and things inside the cave all year long. And by the way, the air would go across the meadow and it would make it freeze inside there, and you'd have these big cones of ice, and you'd go in other areas, and they're just big ice fields. And so, of course, the Indians and other people would take advantage of that because there had been artifacts and that found in there, but in taking care of meat, refrigerating meat during the summer to make it last longer, things like that. But anyway, that's also right in the middle of what's called Bullionville. And so if you get into stories about ghost towns and that in Utah, you'll find Bullionville, which was a gold mining town. And if you know right where it's at, you can find a little bit of rubble foundation. There's not much left to see. They used to have boardwalks and everything, and there was quite a bit of mining up in that area. Well, you come up. Oh, and by the way, there's in the spring runoff, there's a pretty good river that runs right into that mouth of that cave, a Big Brush Creek cave, and goes back and disappears. And so if you walk up that creek a little bit, you can find some of these mine shafts from Bullionville, that right at the river level, going back into hard rock and that, and some will go back 100 feet or so. They don't go, I've never found one that went back a long ways, but we walked up through there. Well, we walked up higher one day, and I had a group of people with me, and we walked up the stream a ways, and had to use the bathroom, so I walked out. You walk in the bottom of the stream because there's all kinds of thorn bushes and that really thick on the side, so you don't want to walk up on the side. You're walking the cobble rocks, and at the bottom of this, it dries up real soon in the year, so you're walking in a dry riverbed. And so we were walking in that, and I had to use the bathroom, so I walked up the bank a little bit. There was a bush right there, and I walked up behind the bush, and right behind the bush, there's a little hole, like a badger hole or something, a little bit bigger than that. And I'm thinking, okay, this has to be a cave-in into a mine. So I got down on my belly and shimmied down in, and sure enough, then I was able to stand up, and I'm in a mine shaft. Obviously, it's been hidden. It's not a cave-in. It's been buried up so that it's been invisible on the outside until it caved in a little bit. And so it became obvious real quick that there had been two entrances into the mine. And so I followed over to where the other entrance was, and it's buried up there too, but I paced it off, so then I came outside and paced over the amount of paces, and no sign of any kind of a shaft or anything. There's nothing there. And so went back, got in the mine. The mine followed a great big vein down on a pretty steep angle for a couple 100 feet, and then it flattened out for about maybe 4 or 5 feet, and then it did about a 9-10 foot vertical drop, and then it took off again. And there, inside there, I found windlasses, and that made out of pine poles and so forth, where they'd run the ropes over to pull up buckets and different things, and they'd worn down. You know, a big pine pole, they were worn down to about an inch or so in the middle, all the way around, and we didn't have any rope with us or anything where we could go down. It wasn't very far vertical drop, but we didn't have any way to go down, so we had to leave it at that point. Well, we went just a little tiny bit further up the canyon. There was a little bit of a draw in a flat place, so I walked up there out of the bottom of the river, and there was an obvious place where there had been a cabin. And when I say it was obvious, for any of you who have gone into the 1800s cabins and that from early pioneer days and that, what do you find? Here's your next question. What do you find in these old mid-1800 cabins? Okay, dirt floor, fireplace. Usually it isn't just the fireplace you find. Usually there's still walls and maybe even some of the ceiling, but it's usually on the ground, and the walls are really sagged in and so forth. And those will date back into the mid-1800s. This one was suspect of being Spanish just because it's probably older than Pioneer Day, in that the only way you could tell there had been a cabin there was the weeds don't grow where the walls were. Totally rotted away. You can't see anything left of the rotted logs or anything, but you can see about a 1 foot wide strip in a perfect rectangle in the weeds where the weeds won't grow, and then right in the middle on one end you see all those stone rubble where there'd been a fireplace there. Okay, so we have a really old cabin. We have a mine that's had 2 entrances to it, and both of them are buried up. And so what have you got? Well, could be Spanish, don't know, but for the most part, people aren't going to go to those efforts to hide things up, and you're not going to find something that's that rotted away and so forth unless it's really old. And so there's a lot of those kinds of things around, a lot of them. They just have to be found and so forth. Let's see. Time's getting on, and I've got 1,000 things to talk about. We'll tell you a couple of real good ones since I promised a few. Let's see. We started talking about maps. Let's talk real briefly about Indian maps, because a lot of people claim to know where there's Indian maps. What are Indians going to put on a map? Another test question here. What's an Indian going to put on a map?
Water.
Okay, water. Water, in my opinion, is a big one for the Indians. What else, potentially? Okay, they might show where a shelter is. They might show a pathway to get through a mountain pass.
The cache of stuff they use.
Okay, what kind of cache would an Indian have?
Arrowheads.
Okay, they might have equipment to make arrowheads. They might have baskets. A lot of those granaries, a lot of those things they didn't take with them. Now think about, not watching. Of course, you guys are all young enough. You missed out on Roy Rogers and all those kind of things. But you see some of these shows. We saw a lot of the cowboy and Indian shows when I was a kid, black and white TVs and so forth. And you see the Indians riding their horses and having the big wars back and forth. Now, when did the Indians get horses, and how'd they get them? They got them from the Spanish. How long the Spanish been in here? That's debatable. A lot of people say 300 years. There's probably a lot of evidence going back as much as 500 years. But even if we say that there were Spaniards in here 500 years ago, that's how long the Indians had horses potentially, and how many of them had horses. If you read early histories of Utah, and there's a lot of them out there, they'll tell you most of the Indians didn't have any horses in their tribe. They were all on foot nomadic, no horses at all. the ones who did have horses, typically it would be just a few of the tribe and the rest would be on foot. And so as a result, we're talking foot traffic. If we're...
I think the Utes a later group though, but did the Utes kind of trade horses?
Yeah, they did. They stole a lot of horses. They would typically, they'd go to California, all over. The Spanish Trail, everybody thinks that all had to do with gold. Very little was done on gold traffic. When I say very little, percentage-wise, very little was trafficking gold ore and gold and those kind of things. Most of the use of the Spanish Trail was moving cattle and horses on the Spanish Trail. And they moved thousands of them. And so some of it, you could come to Utah and trade horses and cows, and then you'd steal everybody's horses and cows here and take them back to California and trade there and then steal everything. I mean, they did a lot of trafficking of animals on the Spanish Trail. And so you've got a lot of animal trade. They did take, and by the way, there's lots of different forks in that on the Spanish Trail. And you can get in certain areas here in Utah where they've tracked Spanish Trail, and even going up one canyon, the trail may split in 20 different places and all end up in the same place. So they didn't necessarily have a well-beaten path all the time. They all followed exactly the same path. Some would go up the drainage, some would go up the ridge, that go all over the place. And so if you can find some of the writing and so forth, some of the archaeological studies that they've done on Spanish Trail, there's a lot of different sections of the Spanish Trail, and some of them going to different areas and so forth. And so it wasn't always going to mines. Let's move a little bit further over. We'll move over to White Rocks. By the way, I didn't tell everybody to start with. I told Terry that there's a few things that I am going to tell that I would prefer that everybody shut off any recording devices. So if you'll do that right now, everybody that's running any kind of recording device, I'm going to tell you a couple of stories that you won't hear in any other place, probably. As long as everybody's recording stuff's down, I'll tell you.
Again.
Okay.
Maps.
And we may get to a couple other ones too that we'll have you turn off later on as we go, just depending on what I tell. I've got, like I say, I've got drawers full of maps and I've got stacks of diaries with these kind of stories for people. There's lots of them out there. When people think that we're through telling stories and that, it's just a matter of when somebody wants to either tell them or publish another book, because there's lots of them out there. It's not a dead subject by any means. Okay, so Indian maps. I have one here. Let's see, get in the big one there. And you won't be able to see it real good here, but and I'll pass it around you. Try not to get any more fingerprints than you have to. I know I got dirty hands from being out in the dirt and everything, and I can print another one, but I want you to see what, in my opinion, a real map looks like. That I think there's no question but what it's a map. And this is an Indian map. None of you can see what that is, can you? I'll pass around so you can see. But basically, I want you to see a little bit of it. So let's see. Can somebody hold that for me right there where I can see it? And if I put it up there, you can see it pretty good, probably. And then they'll come around with the light, and we'll pass around so you can see it up close. And then I'm going to talk about this one a little bit, and I'll talk about some other maps. There's all kinds of maps, what I consider to be a map. This being an Indian map, and I don't think there are very many Indian maps. There's Indian symbols and things that will help you, and I'll talk a little bit about Indian ones first, and we'll talk about some Spanish ones and other ones. And I'll tell you the history of this particular map. For those of you over this way, you can kind of see through there. So a friend of mine, if you want to take this around and let everybody look at it kind of close, you can see my hand in the photograph, so you can kind of get an idea how big this is. And I'm going to give you another description, and this is how the map was actually found. Down in central Utah, near one of the cities, there's a place that's pretty popular for people to hunt arrowheads, and that there used to be a lot of Indian camps in the area, passing through and so forth. And so he and a friend was out one time looking for arrowheads and so forth, and they'd finished doing their arrowhead hunting, and they were heading back to their car, and he looked down on the ground, and this particular map, it's the size and the shape, basically, of a piece of Wonder Bread. Okay, so it's a rock on the ground, and so it's just kind of a joke thing. He sees it on the ground and he reaches down and picks it up to tell his friend, hey, here's a petrified piece of Wonder Bread I just found. And he picks it up, and on the bottom, laying on the ground, is the map. So when he picks it up, all of a sudden it's a map that you couldn't tell without picking it up. It's not very big. It's about the size of a slice out of a loaf of bread. All right, as you pass around and look at it, you're going to see a number of things. You're going to see probably, and I'm guessing, but probably down the middle there's about 5 parallel lines, and you're going to see, you're going to need to get a light with those guys or something so they can see that. So you'll see about 5 parallel lines down the middle, and I'm speculating and guessing that that's probably a river running through. And what do you see on both sides? Some of you that look at it, what do you see? What do you think? You see mountains on both sides. You see the mountain peaks and you see the valleys and so forth.
Yep.
Do any of you see an X marks the spot where they buried their gold treasure that the Indians probably didn't care anything about, or their stash, or their anything else? How do you think they use that map? I don't see any kind of mark on that map that's showing you need to go to this spot. And so this is speculation on my behalf, and I think about these things, and I try to figure out how was this map used, because obviously it's a map. How do you think that map was used? You haven't had a lot of time thinking about it like I have, but I think I know possibly how that map was used. I think how that map was used was you held that in your hand, and you're talking to another person, and you say, if you want to shoot some big elk, you go up to see that mountain peak. That's this one right here on the map. You go up that canyon right there, and there's some of the biggest elk you ever saw in your life. If you want to go over here, you can get a really good water supply, and there's a pretty flat place to set up your teepees. I mean, that kind of thing, I think, is how that map was used. It was point and talk, and here's the mountain peak over there, and this is what you find over there, and if you want something else, it's this mountain peak or this drainage right here, and you go over here. I haven't had a chance to go down there yet and see if it corresponds with the mountain range right at that particular point. But I suspect when I go down there that I'm going to be able to find a river and find all those mountain peaks on both sides of the river. Still, there isn't any place to find on the map because I don't have the Indian that drew it right there to tell me, go right here and you'll get some of the biggest elk you ever saw in your life kind of thing. But I suspect that's how an Indian map, that particular map, I suspect was used. And it could have been a shaman. It could have been, if he was training somebody, he could have said, if you need to get some of the gold, you go up this canyon. But he hasn't put an X. What they say in Indiana Jones, the first one when he's teaching in the classroom, what does it say about X marks the spot?
X never marks the spot.
X never marks the spot. And I think for the most part that's probably true. But maybe not in all cases, but for a lot of them, that's just wishful thinking when we think we're going to find a map and it's going to show us where the treasure is and that. Most of the time, I don't think that's the case. The map's going to get you into an area or something like that, but I don't think there's going to be an X or something that says you walk right over here and there it is. There may be symbols on a tree or something like that. All right, so there's different kinds of Indian maps potentially, but for the most part, I don't think they're going to get us to gold or anything like that. They might get us to a stash where there's baskets or something. And by the way, the Indians leave everything behind. Why do they leave everything behind when they move around? They move around all the time. They move around typically because of the weather or maybe because of the game. You know, they don't want to stay in the winter, so they're going to migrate south or to someplace warmer. They're going to go out to the Great Salt Lake because they'll hold sacred ceremonies out there. They're going to soak in the salt water to get rid of their infections and things like that. So they're moving around all the time, mostly on foot because they don't have horses, and they migrate for long distances. And so guess what? Your big Indian grindstones and that, are you going to pack those on your back, walking for hundreds of miles maybe? No, you're not. You're going to leave them there, and you're going to migrate back through the same areas, and you're going to go to the same camps, and you're going to rotate your grinding stones over. They're upside down because you don't want them filled with water and freeze and break in the wintertime. So you roll them over so they won't collect water and that if you can, if they're not permanently into the rock and so forth. and you're going to go back, and so you're going to hide baskets and pots and all kinds of things that you don't have to take with you that may have food in them. You may do some of that, but most of it, your utility things are going to be right there. When you go down to your next camp and set up camp for a few weeks or whatever, you're gonna get into all your pots and everything. You may have some kind of maps to help you get there. Let's talk real quick about one that's a little bit of a pet peeve of mine, because without mentioning names, all you'll probably know mostly who I'm talking about, but they have one they fight over, whether it's navigational symbols, and they find a lot of them through the Arizona Strip and across the bottom of Utah and down into New Mexico and that. And there's a big fight over whether these are navigational. They're flat petroglyphs. You walk on them on the ground. They're not on the wall. There's been a few of them found in caves on the ceiling. There's been a few of them found on the walls, but typically I think they're probably referencing these that you find on the ground. And what do they look like? For those of you who've seen them, I say they look like a banjo a lot. There's a big circle. There's a straight line that comes out of the middle of the circle and penetrates through the circle, goes out, and then there's some crosses usually on it, and there's some dots, and they're not all identical. Some people say these are navigational. They are going to get you from the East Coast to the West Coast. Some of them try to tie it in. As Mormons, we love to tie everything in with the Book of Mormon. This is the Nephites trying to get to a group somewhere in Central America or something. And so you got to know the North Star, and you got to know the rising of Mercury, and you got to know all this stuff. And navigational, like if you're doing a boat, and every time you find these, it's going to get you into your group of people. Not so. Bunch of garbage. University of Utah had their archaeology department a long time ago, and they published a big book on it you can get and read. It's a water glyph, and the person who says that's a bunch of bunk because I can show you where they're 10 feet from a big river, why do you need to have this navigational map, if you will, that tells you where you're going to get a drink of water when there's a river 10 feet away that runs year-round? It's stupid. It's not trying to tell you that's where you get your drink tonight. It's trying to tell you where you get your drink tomorrow night after you cross in the desert. And they've gone out. You stand in the circle. You look out. You see the line across, and that's the horizon that you're looking at from that point. Looking down the line that goes out, you see the horizon, and the dot shows you where your water source is, whether it's a river, whether it's a pothole, somewhere where there's water. And when you travel that way across the desert for a day, and I'll guarantee you, if you're talking treasure and you're walking across the desert, what's your treasure? Water. It better be your water, because you're going to be dead in a day or so. And so you walk out there, you walk to this hole, and in somewhere around 90-something% of the cases, they've gone out on hundreds of these, they've been able to find water from these water glyphs. It's a map, and it's telling not only you, but the person who's following you, where you're going to get your next drink of water in the desert. Now, when you get into Martineau's book and that, they show you some symbols for water. They show you spirals, right-hand spiral, left-hand spiral. Some mean go up, some mean go down. A lot of that will tell you where you can get a drink of water on your petroglyphs. Those are the type of Indian maps you're going to see. And that's what's important to most Indians is water, or maybe getting some game or something like that. That's their important stuff, and you might get an Indian map to most of that stuff. That's about all you're going to get, in my opinion, on an Indian map of some kind, or symbols. Spanish stuff, again, why are you going to leave the gold behind, and why are you not going to come back and get it? Unless you're wiped out in an ambush or something, you're going to have, you're going to come back. And the only reason you're going to leave any of it to start with is if you're being chased out by the Indians, or if you're massacred and somebody else is coming in trying to get her that. Otherwise, you're going to take everything out when you leave for the season with you. Unless you produce more gold than you can carry out, those kinds of things. And so now I'm going to tell you, I don't know time what. All of you want to listen to some more? I don't know how long you want to stay here. I can tell you stories like this all night long. You ready for some more? And any of you who get tired of all this can go home and sleep or whatever in your tents, whatever. I'll tell you a few more stories, good ones that you've never heard anywhere and won't hear anywhere else. Let's see. I'm trying to think of a couple other good ones you'd like. I'll tell you one of the big massacre stories. Now, when I started researching many years ago, I come to the conclusion, talking with people that had lived with the Indians or Indians and so forth, that there was 3 talked about, and now I know there's more than that, but apparently there were 3 fairly good-sized massacres of the Spanish. A lot of little ones, but 3 fairly major ones. And so when I was taking off-road, and by the way, I don't think I finished telling you, after we spent all day looking at stuff, Spanish stuff and other stuff, they took me to some sacred burial grounds and told me the stories behind them and so forth. No relation to the Spaniards. It was fights between Indian tribes and that. And at the end, they said, if you ever come back up here by myself, they said around this Spanish stuff and that, they used to kill you, or the popular thing is they'd cut a finger off.
Like George Thompson.
So if you went in looking for stuff on tribal grounds, and if you're real smart, I mean, if you're stupid, you take your maps and your Spanish stuff and that, and they're going to find all that. But if you're smart, you kind of memorize everything you need to know, and then you don't take anything that would indicate that you're in there treasure hunting. And so when they catch you in one of these sensitive areas, they'll quiz you down, say you're in here treasure hunting that, and if you convince them, no, I just hiking, I didn't know I was on Indian ground and everything, they cut a finger off. Guess what happens next time you're in there? What do they look for very first thing? Let's see your fingers. Let's see your hands. How many fingers do you have? If you're missing a finger not too many years ago, then nobody ever hear of you again. You're dead the second time, okay, when you're in sensitive areas. So those kind of things happen not all that long ago, and there's quite a bit of information out there about people who would get killed going into these sensitive areas. Well, when I was a kid, we used to go up into Miners Gulch, which was just off the reservation. You had to go through Rock Creek to get there across the Indian ground, and we used to see little reflections and things up on the sides of the cliffs and that, and you get your binoculars and you'd look at them, and they were blazers and things like that at vantage points where they could see for miles and that, and there would be multiple people up there. We knew other people that went up through there looking for stuff, and we were looking for some cannons and stuff we had information on. And anyway, some of the other professional treasure hunters we talked to that went up through there did find a number of cannonballs and all kinds of things up in the same area we were at, and they said one time they stopped on the reservation just to get out and pee. And they said, can you stop there on the reservation for just a few minutes and there will be an Indian patrol right there. And they says they would tell them every day they'd cross the reservation that whole summer. They could tell them the day and the hour, which direction they were going, everything. I mean, they keep real close track in those sensitive areas. And so anyway, we heard later on 3 guys from Hillfield got up in the same area we were at and found a cannon. It wasn't the same one we were looking for, but they tried to get it out and it was too heavy and they eventually had to abandon the project. The one we were told about was a guy that married my great aunt, and he was up in there and he was raised by the Ute Indians, but they were doing some timbering and so forth. And anyway, he found, on his off time, he did a little bit of prospecting. That he'd found 7 Spanish mines up in Miners Gulch, and then he found a cannon. It was a big one. It would shoot a cannonball about the size of a bowling ball. Now, that's a huge cannon. He found it, guess where? Where did we talk about? Where did he find it? Down in the bottom of a drainage, and about a foot of the barrel was sticking out of the ground. And he had a 6-wheel drive skidder to pull timber out and down to the sawmill. So he was able to get that up on the ridge up above it, and he ran his cable off his winches down and wrapped it around the barrel. He didn't try to dig the cannon out or anything. He was just going to winch it up on top with the 6-wheel drive skidder. Chained the front of the skidder up to the trees, tried to winch it out, and it ripped the front end off the skidder. Wasn't able to even move the cannon. Okay, so he found that. He talked to one of his friends that lived in Fort Mighton, and he had an alcoholic friend that lived there, and he was talking to him. He says, I found this great big cannon. His friend says, yeah, I've seen that same cannon. He says, part of the wheel sticking out of the ground and some things. And he says, no, only about a foot of the barrel sticking out of the ground. And he says, no, there's part of the wheel sticking out of the ground. He says, no, I looked over really good, tried to pull it out. There's no wheel sticking out of the ground. So they got maps and started comparing them. They're about 2.5 miles apart on those 2 big cannons, all up in that same area. I was Weaver County building official and a business license director, and I hired a contractor to come in and review plans for me. And on weekends, he would go with 5 other friends, and they would go out to different restaurants, and they'd drink coffee and tell all their fishing stories and hunting stories and everything every Saturday. And so one Monday he came back to work, and he says, "Boy, you should have been with me Saturday." He says, "We went up here in Ogden to this restaurant." He says, "We were sitting down talking, and one of the 6 guys brought in one of his friends that none of the rest of us knew." And he says, "These guys," and he tells us the story that they got hold of a Spanish map, and they'd gone into an area up in Rock Creek, and they were able to dig into this cave, and it's full of gold bars. And he says the gold bars are like 3 or 4 feet long and as big around as your arm, and there's thousands of them in there, not just a few, thousands of them stacked in there. And he says we probably wouldn't have believed him, but he went home and he brought one back in his truck and let us see it and handle it. And so he's telling me the story, and he says they were real secretive about his name and everything, and so I didn't have much information other than the story. Well, I'd had the plans examiner for a while, and I trusted him and had seen everything and that, so I was pretty excited. But it's hard to find people and say, "I hear that you got thousands of Spanish gold bars. Tell me about it." You know, they're going to say, "What are you talking about?" And so I soon after that, I left Weaver County and I went up to Morgan County, and several years had passed, about 7 years had passed, and I was still trying to figure out who some of these guys were. There was a number of them involved. And so this guy told him the story. He says, so what we're doing is we drive a truck up there every weekend that we can, 1 day a week, and we bring 2 gold bars out. And then we've got a guy up in Alaska, and we cut the gold bars with the hacksaw, cut it up into manageable pieces, and then we load it in with a bunch of equipment and stuff in cardboard boxes. We put it on a ship, and we ship it up to Alaska. And this guy takes it out and mints it into coins, and he takes 50% and gives us 50%. And so that was a story that he heard. And so 7 years later, it was, I think it might, I can't even remember the newspaper, if it was Standard Exaggerator with Ogden, or if it was, it might have been one of the 2 big Salt Lake newspapers. One of them came up and interviewed me on Spanish stuff, and they did a three-page spread, the main thing in the paper on Spanish stuff, and it was all in color, and they quoted me a bunch and stuff. And so the day before that was released, I had a friend up in Morgan come up to me. He says, "Hey, I know a guy up here who they found a whole bunch of Spanish gold bars," and he told me enough about it that I knew it was the same guy. So now I knew who he was, or who the main guy was, and I was figuring out how I was going to get hold of him. This newspaper article come out, and I get a phone call, and it's this guy that I'm trying to figure out how to approach to talk to, and he goes, "We got a lot in common. I want to meet with you and talk." And I says, "Yeah, we can probably arrange that." So he invites me over to his business. I go over to his business, and he's got it's an automotive auto repair shop. So he's got his office in the front. You go in the back, and it's about 2-story high open building in the back where they put all the cars in that pretty good sized building. And I'm talking to him, and so he's telling me the story. He says we had this Spanish map or information. He says we went up, we dug it out with a backhoe and got into it. And he says there's thousands of these bars, these gold bars, and they're about 3 feet long. And he shows me a photograph of one, and I was finally able to actually see and handle this bar. And so here he's got this gold bar that's about this long and probably about this big around, and he says we took the first one out, and he says we cut about 6 inches off from it, and we took it down to Salt Lake to an assay office, and they ran it through to see how pure the gold was. And there's almost no gold in it. It's brass and bronze, and there was no gold to it. And so at that point, they never did their plan because they figured they didn't want to go to federal penitentiary for smuggling brass and bronze out of the Uintas. So they left it all there. And I asked him questions. I said, with that amount of bars, and by the way they were casting that, we suspect it's Aztec, not Spanish or anything. It's an Aztec mining operation, and this is up in the White Rocks, or excuse me, the Rock Creek drainage. And so I asked him, I said, did you see ancient tools, mining tools of any kind, all that? And he says, you couldn't even, there were so many bars, you couldn't even get inside the cave to look around. It's totally filled with these bars. And I was able to handle some of the bars and so forth. And he's told me that he'll take me up and show me where it's at. I've never gone up. But I have now met, there was about 5 guys involved. The guy with the backhoe, they were on Indian ground and they got caught. He lost his backhoe, never got it back. He's quite bitter, obviously. But anyway, so that's another mining operation and probably a really ancient one. But again, it makes me wonder with that amount, that's got to be way over 1 year's worth of mining. And it makes you wonder, with metals as precious as they are, why didn't they remove it all and take it and use it somewhere? It's all stored up there in Rock Creek.
It's a lot of tin here, and because if you're going to make bronze, you mix copper and tin, and that makes your alloy. So is that prevalent in this region, or?
Yeah, Rock Creek's this way a little bit, not very far.
Like the tin. I know copper's in Utah, but I just wasn't sure about tin.
And so it's just kind of one of those mystery things that's been found up here. Another big mining operation that's ancient. Don't know what's all about. It just adds to the mystery of everything. Tell you a little bit more about being able to go off-road up in Rock Creek. This is one of the things that was most fascinating to me. It's the biggest massacre that I've heard of that happened between the Indians and the Spanish. And I was taken over and shown I knew where the one mission was already because of this guy drawing me the map. And the mission's right there where you swim in the underwater passage. And I was taken up and shown where the second mission was, and I was told that there's a third mission. And we were sitting right where the mission was, and it's real close to this boom hill I talked about and so forth. And right on the side of the hill, it comes down real steep, right, and then flattens out right at the mission. You can plain as day. I mean, it's really worn in. You can see the narrow tracks where they brought all their English carts down with all the gold on it, and that from this particular mining operation, maybe multiple mines or whatever, but it came out right there at the mission. And so we're looking at all this path and everything where they bring their carts down. And so he's telling me the story that they're coming down the end of the season. They've got all their gold with them, and there's 117 armed Spaniards. They all have blunderbusses or whatever, and they've got cannons with them and so forth. They've got all their slaves with them. They've got all their peons and other mine workers. They have to have religious people with them. They've got the whole entourage coming down. They come out right where the mission is. The Padres in the mission tell them the Indians have set up an ambush. They're going to ambush and kill you. And they said, we're not afraid of the Indians. We've got 117 armed soldiers and that we can easily destroy any kind of body that the Indians are going to put up against it. They pass the mission and they head down, and there's a great big bowl, and they are going down through that, and it bowls all the way around, except in the far end, there's a big notch that comes down to the same level as the bottom, so you can go through the bottom of the bowl. You don't have to go up over the top. You go through at the same level. We drove down into the bowl. So they're heading down there with all their gold and everything for the season. They've got 72 bars of gold. They've got them in wood crates. There's 4 bars in a crate. They've got pretty much equal amount of raw gold in nuggets and flake gold. And they head down into this bowl. When they get into the middle of the bowl, the Indians come boiling over the top of the bowl and start attacking them. There's way more Indians than they ever would have expected. The women and children come in behind the warriors, sit all the way around the top of the bowl, chanting and playing their drums. They come down and attack the Spaniards. The Spaniards immediately are seeing that they're overpowered, they're outmanned by large numbers, and that they're going to lose. And so they determine that the only way that they're going to survive is if they can make it through this break in the bowl and get the Indians chasing behind them. They think they can hold them off with cannons and everything, and they can probably get away. So they take off for the end of the bowl. When they get down there, large contingency of Indians are waiting at the end, come in, plug the end, and they can't get through the way they figured they could escape. They're fighting the Indians, they're losing big time, and so they dig foxholes. You can still see the foxholes. You can see all the impressions in the ground where they dug in so they could lay down and get some cover in the ground, and huge battles going on. The Indians are smart enough, they back off far enough that they can't shoot them and one thing or another, They hold them in their foxholes for 3 days, no water or food. After 3 days, they send an Indian down and they tell them to surrender. About half of them surrender. They take them up on the side of the hill where they can see them and they skin them all alive. The other half, guess what they do? We ain't going to surrender. And so they fought to the death. They kill them all. They took all the animals, all the donkeys, and by the way, they don't want this. They cut the feet off the donkeys, and so a fair number of stories that you read about, you'll read where people find holes in that, and they find all these donkey feet in there. They can't understand why they're not finding the rest of the carcasses. Now, they believe that the Indians believe if you cut the feet off from them, that their spirits can't move and all those kind of things and give away things. So they'll cut the feet off the donkeys. They take all the donkeys, they take all the Spaniards, all the armor, all the slaves, everybody that's killed, and they take all the raw gold, and they take them over to a place where the major Indian trail went up through Rock Canyon. Now, this is before, obviously before they had road or anything up there, but they had some major Indian trails up there. They take them up, they put them in the bottom of one of the drainages. They have the women come over with sticks and work all the caliche loose and everything and bury them all up right under the Indian trail. So they walk right over the top of the burial. When the government came in and ran their roads up through there to build the reservoirs, that they told them that if you want to run a government road through here, this is where you're going to run it. They had them put the road right over the top on the Indian Trail. It's right under the paved road. Then they took all of the bar gold in the crates. They went up and just threw it out in the top of a canyon, which they've shown me it's got 100 yards off the road. They didn't bury it or anything. It's sitting right there in the top of the canyon, and a bunch of choke cherries up there. And so that was probably the biggest massacre that took place between the Indians and the Spaniards. Killed them all. So that group was wiped out. But there's the trails and everything up there are super easy to see. They've traveled them enough. They're not overgrown at all or anything. You can see right exactly where they brought those English carts down. They took me in right to some mines. I was right at the entrance within a couple of feet of some of the Spanish mines and so forth. There's a lot of Spanish riding up in Rock Creek. Again, you've got to get off road to see most of it, but there's a lot of Spanish riding up there in the canyons and the rocks up there and so forth. But there were some other pretty neat things that up in Rock Creek that I was shown, and some things I was told about that again are not there anymore, but I was shown different things and they talked about it. But there's a lot of big mines in Rock Creek too, not just one or two, but there's quite a few Spanish gold mines and some that are very rich in that area. I'll tell you another one. And I've told this to a number of people, and as near as I can tell, nobody's ever taken me up on telling them how to find a really rich gold mine. In fact, I'll tell you a couple more in White Rocks Canyon. So in White Rocks Canyon, the guy who told me the story about the 27 dead Spanish soldiers and that, I asked him, by the way, I says, well, what do you think happened to those guys? Why are they all dead in this cave? And he saw it when he was 12, and now he's about 100 years old, and so he's had a lot of years to think about it. He says, well, when I was 12 and I used to ride up through White Rocks in the drainage and that with the White Rocks River and everything, he says it used to bubble all over in the river. And he says it was gases or something coming out of the earth, volcanic movement or something to that effect. And he says, we always figured it was poisonous gas in it. And he says, you don't see any of that anymore. But he says, when I was 12, he says, it was all over up through there. And he says, I think they got back in there and there was poisonous gas and it killed them all. Well, I've had quite a few years now to think about it. And I didn't really agree with him right to start with. And the more I think about it, the more I disagree with what it is. I figure, hey, typically if there's poisonous gas and you got a bunch of people in there, somebody's going to figure out something's wrong. Even if you can't smell or that, they're going to start seeing people acting funny and that, and a lot of them are going to get out of there, and probably eventually they'll drag everybody out of there and bury them or something. And so I've given a lot of thought trying to figure out what it is. Now, the Indians, when they killed them, guess what? They didn't go in and lay you down in neat rows and put your armor between them and all that kind of stuff. They just checked your bodies in there and buried the thing up and eliminated your tailings, and so nobody could find it and so forth. And so I don't think it was the Indians killing them. And the way he described it, now how big are most of your Spanish mines? How easy are they to get into? They take out just the ore body and as little as they can, so one of their slaves can squeeze through. They don't make like our great big shafts to follow a little ore body through. They take out the ore body and just enough for an Indian to squeeze through there. And typically they're probably malnourished and little skinny guys and that, and so they're not very big shafts. And so when you have this kind of thing that they've got up there, typically when you find a Spanish mine, it's going to be something that's real hard to get into for those of us who like to eat and that kind of thing. So you have those kind of difficulties getting back into their mines typically and so forth. But they have some real good ones back in there. And so anyway, so one of the stories that I was so my opinion, and this is just thoughts because I'm trying to think of anything I can think of why you'd have 27 dead Spanish soldiers in there, and I've come up with two possibilities. And I suspect it's one of the two, but all it is my theory. One of them is they caught a disease. And if it's something that would kill people, you'd get in there. Oh, and by the way, because it's this big room, I don't think it's a mine. I think it's a cave. And so if they're up there mining the area, they'll get to, they probably covered the area real good. They may have found this cave, and they were using that for some, for shelter, for housing or something. And they went in, and if they had some kind of bad disease, eventually that would have killed all of them, and they would have, if any of them got away, they would have left them and not come back because you'd get the disease and you'd die from it. And those diseases can last a long time, even if they're all dead. So that's one of my thoughts. The second one is, I think maybe they were up there mining, and an early winter set in. They started to get a heavy snowstorm early in the year. They hadn't packed up to leave yet. They packed up and started trying to get out. It was snowing so heavy that they decided, hey, we know where there's a cave. We'll take shelter in there. It's only going to last a couple of days. We'll get the Indian summer. Snow will melt, and we'll head back down to Mexico. They went into the cave, and it didn't let up. It kept storming. You'd send people out to find game for your food, to shoot your deer and so forth, and eventually all the deer and that would move down, which they always do for their feed, and it would get more and more scarce. In survival mode, you try to lay down and you don't move around much to burn calories and so forth, so they're all probably laying down other than their scouts going out trying to get game. And as the game gets more scarce and it gets more cold, you die of starvation and of the cold and so forth up there. So my guess is that it's one of those two things that have killed all of those up there. Now, another story up Rock Creek. I was in the building trades for a period of time, and I was working down in Vernal. There was a bunch of apartment complexes or condos, and I was doing the finish work on it. And the electrician who was working on it was from Mountain Home or somewhere. Anyway, we talked quite a bit, and he was telling me a story one time, and he says he had a niece who was getting married in the Salt Lake Temple. And he says the family went up to the Salt Lake Temple, and they got there early, and they were going to go through a session or whatever, and they were meeting with the groom's family for the first time. And so he's meeting an uncle or something to the groom, and he happens to be, can't remember what the title was then, maybe the same thing, but basically he was a janitor for the temple, Salt Lake Temple. And so they get talking, and he says, hey, you want to go down and see all the tunnels and all this stuff from, real early days and how they did things to set up for modern day for running electricity and everything, all these different things. And he says, yeah, that'd be great. And so he takes him down and he's showing him that, and he's telling him a story, and he says, I was up in White Rocks Canyon, and there was fly fishing. And he says, I had my very favorite fly on, and he says, I come back, took the hook out of the water, and came back to throw it out again, fly fishing. And he said, it got snagged in some bushes up behind me. And he said, I pulled on it a little bit, and it was stuck pretty good in there, and it was my favorite fly, and I didn't want to break my line and lose it. So he says, I set my pole down, and I climbed back up in the bushes to get my fly out. And he says, when I got up there was a mine right there behind the bushes that I couldn't see when I was in the creek. And he says, I didn't have a flashlight or anything like that with me, but he says, I took out took out some more samples right there in the mouth of the mine, and he says, I took it down to Salt Lake, and he took it into an assay office, began an assay. Well, it come back really heavy in gold, and he says a couple of days later he got a call from a Japanese firm. Now, some of these big firms watch all the assay offices and that, and they get all this information of who came in and what their assays were and everything. He gets a call, and they tell him they'll give him $3 million to tell him where he got these horse samples from. And he says, I've thought about it quite a bit for a few months now, and he says, I don't know if that kind of money is going to destroy my life or not, and I didn't know what to do, so I went in and talked to my bishop and asked him what I should do, and the bishop said, I can't tell you what to do. You're going to have to make that decision on your own. And he says, I still haven't made my mind up, and a couple of weeks after that, he died. Okay, so my thought is, where can you catch fish, fly fishing in the White Rocks River? Not very far up. It's too small. Once you go up just a little ways, it's not that long where you can fly fish. How far back could you catch a fly when you're fly fishing on either side of the river? Not very far. Is all you need is a couple of people on each side of the bank to go up looking for a mine shaft and where you could fish, and you're going to find his mine, and the information was worth $3 million just on somebody looking at his assets. So there's a good treasure story for you to go up and find your gold mine. Here a couple of years ago, well, it's been about 2 years since I talked with him. One of the big subdivisions that we were doing in Morgan, they hired a company, and the guy came in, and he one of the guys that was in, and he was doing curb, gutter, and sidewalk in the subdivision. I got talking to him, and he said, well, a few years back, he says, we lived over in Roosevelt. And he said, my wife taught up at Union High School, and she taught gymnastics, and she taught PE and gymnastics. And so they lived out on the can't think what you call it, right above Bottle Hollow, between there and Roosevelt. There's a kind of a plateau that has a school on it and everything. Anyway, what was that? Somebody said, anyway, whatever they call that, they lived out on there, and so he did a lot of trading with the Utes. He traded horses and horse tack, and he got to know several of the male Utes pretty good out there in horse trading that. And so his wife decided she wanted to build him a big building there by their house, and she was going to teach private gymnastic lessons. And so he built her this building, and he says, well, you know, the Ute kids get really ignored by their parents, and my mother was real heavily involved with them. She was in social services all her life, and she knew most of the Utes out there and so forth. And so the parents typically, the grandparents raise the children. I don't know if that's changed, but when I was a kid, the grandparents would raise the children of each generation, and the parents would just kind of go do their thing, and grandparents would raise the little kids, and then when the parents reached the age, if they ever did, being grandparents, then they'd take care of the kids. And anyway, they kind of ignore the kids. They don't get much of a chance doing anything in that. And so he had a lot of friends and that, so he asked his wife, he said, if I bring some Ute kids up here, they won't have any money or anything, but would you teach them gymnastics for free? And she says, yeah, I'll do that. And he says, the parents won't, and the grandparents won't even bring them up here, even if it's free. So I'll run, they had a big band or something. He says, I'll go collect some of the Ute kids and bring them up here if you'll teach them gymnastics. So they were doing that. Anyway, a combination of the horse trading and bringing their kids up and teaching gymnastics and that, he got in pretty close with some of the Utes. And so one time, one of the Utes that he was a friend with showed up at his door, and he says, come with me, I want to show you something. So he took him up White Rocks, and he showed me about where it's at on a map. I'm going to go back and talk to him, see if he can show me more accurate. But took him up White Rocks Canyon. They got out. They hiked up the side of the hill quite a ways, and he says they finally come up to a big, heavy wooden door over a cave or a mine shaft or whatever. He told him he could not go inside, and he left him outside while the Ute went inside. He said he was only gone for about 15 minutes, and he came out and gave him what looked like a brand new Calvary saddle. Had all the Calvary markings on it and everything. He told him that it was a Ute burial ground, and that he couldn't go inside there. He's got the Calvary saddle and everything. He's got it in a vacuum pack and a bunch of stuff. I suspected it was a mine, a Spanish mine that's been turned into a new burial ground up there. But they got some pretty cool stuff in there. That was another story. I think there's probably a couple more real good ones that I could tell you. I got tons of these, but all of you know about. Have all of you heard about Del Bascom's copper map? Are there people here who don't know about Del Bascom's copper map? I hear one. Is there only one person here that doesn't know something about it? Del's given me permission to talk about it a little bit as long as I don't let out things that aren't out there. And so I'll give you a brief history and tell you a little bit of my involvement there real quick. And maybe we ought to wind it up. It's getting late. I could go on with stories all night long. But back in, I think it's 1917 or 1927, can't remember which one. Well, first of all of you know about Rhodes, right? The Lost Rhodes mines and so forth. Okay, so the Rhodes family were a German family, and they're one of them that got the way they got their name Rhodes is when they migrated to the United States, and nobody could pronounce their German name, and it was real common to do when you came to customs, New York or whatever. They would give you a new name, and they were given the name of Rhodes. And among other things, the Rhodes family worked with Daniel Boone. They were surveyors. They were wagon masters. They knew a lot about mining, all those kinds of things. And I'm not going to go into all the history behind the Lost Rhodes mines and so forth, but they started out that Chief Walker had a vision, and he called them the Big Hats. In his vision, he saw white men with big rimmed hats come into the area, and Isaac Morley, who was one of the 12 apostles for Brigham Young coming into the area, they could. Chief Walker had seen him personally in the vision, and so when trappers came into the area, he was told to show them where the sacred gold mines were for the gold for the temple, and they had a gold mint where the reflecting pond is now. They minted gold coins for quite a few years. If you didn't hear, just recently a guy sold a set of them. There's a $2.50, $5, and $10. He said he's the person who I'm supposed to make a pact with. And Isaac Morley was pretty old, and he went to the sacred mines to start with, and he only went about twice, and it was too hard for him. And so then they got the Rhodes to start going up and getting the gold, and nobody could follow him. They couldn't even send. One of the brothers went one time when one of them was sick that they had a pact they would only have with one person at a time. Brother went up and he was killed by the Indians. Only the person who had the pact could go up in there. And some of them were sacred Indian mines. They found some of the different gold ore bodies themselves. And so there's quite a few different Rhodes mines. And so that's where they talk about a lot of these lost mines, and some of them have super gold value in them and so forth. So anyway, got to remember which Rhodes mine I was going to talk about now. Oh, and and I'm speculating a little bit on this, but there was a Brigham Young or Joseph Smith. They had the LDS Church had a silversmith, a church silversmith who made a lot of the sacrament trays and those kind of things. They did a lot of silver work for the church. Of course, when they came out west, and Joseph Smith had been killed, and the silversmith came out, and so he was still the silversmith for the church for Brigham Young. Well, for some reason, Brigham Young had him make a map on a sheet of copper, and my speculation is that Rhodes had already made the map on a piece of paper, but he was afraid it was going to get destroyed in a flood or burn up or something, and he thought that would be a better way to preserve it. For whatever reason, they commissioned this silversmith to make a map to 3 sacred mines that they were using on a copper map. The map was stolen from the church back in about 1917, 1927. I can't remember which date, but it's in Dell's book. And so they stole the map, and it's been gone all these years. Not too long ago, Dell was able to do some research, and there was research done. The family was located that had the map, and the map was purchased. The church was offered to take the map back, and the church did research, could not find record of it, and said you can do what you want with the map. The map has tons of detail on it. And in Dell's book, he shows a few sections of the map in detail, and then he shows you a blurred picture of the map because, for obvious reasons, they don't want you to see the whole map. He also tells you it's up in the Moon Lake area in his book. And so I'm not going to give you a whole lot more than what Dell's given you in his book, but I can tell you this. On the map, there are Aztec symbols, there are Indian symbols, and there's Reformed Egyptian symbols on the map. And so, and it shows a lot of things besides just these three mines. It shows you lakes, it shows you all kinds of things. There's a sacred temple site shown on the map, and Dell talks about that. And he shows the Egyptian symbols. Dell's gone out and found a person who's well qualified in the Egyptian language to interpret the Egyptian symbols, and again, he tells you what those are in his book. And all of them but one of the Egyptian symbols, they got to get interpretation from it, and the guy interpreting it took one that looked kind of like a house. It just had two parallel lines coming down, a line across the bottom, and then it had a pitched roof, like a inverted V over the top, like a kid would draw a house, a little kid or something. And he told Dell, and it's in his book, he said, this particular symbol means just what it looks like. It means a house. It has nothing to do with Egyptian or whatever. I don't know why they put this symbol in. And it says that in Dell's book. Well, I did, in doing some of my research for Dell, and I'm doing some ongoing, I've got into Budge's dictionary, which you'd take anywhere in the world probably if you were taking classes in reading Egyptian, and I found the symbol in there. It's not. He said it's not an Egyptian symbol, it's just a picture of a house, and that's what it means. There's a house or something, and it didn't tie in, and I couldn't figure that out. Anyway, I got in Budge's Egyptian dictionary and found it, and it goes right along with all the rest of it. It says that there's a buried mine right there, or treasure or something, and the temple site and so forth. And there's a bunch of all-seeing eyes. Some of them are small on the ground flat. Some of them are embedded stones, great big eyes. Sitting beside the mountain and so forth, and I've seen some of that. But anyway, so we're in a situation now where one that we're working on in conjunction with each other. I'm doing a bunch of aerial photograph work from satellites and airplane photos and everything, and doing overlays and trying to figure out where a lot of this stuff is. Some of it's already been found and so forth, but another map, and a lot of maps are real inaccurate. Why do you think that is? Sometimes it's because people do things on purpose to confuse the map, which never made any sense to me, or at least that's the claim. Why would you draw a map and then purposely make a lot of things screwed up on the map? To me that doesn't make a lot of sense. But one of the problems is, if any one of us now wanted to make a drawn map to get you here to this campsite, you think anybody could follow your map and get here? Some of the maps, maybe somebody would make it here. Most of them, probably people say, I have no idea where that's at. I can't figure it out or whatever. And that's the case with a lot of maps. And so you just can't get there from a map. But in this particular case, if Rhodes did it and they were surveyors by trade, their family, and they drew maps by trade, and then this silversmith copied it, should be a fairly accurate map, I would think. But if you copied it, pretty accurate and so forth. So another one on maps and so forth. But what time's it getting to be? We're probably about time-wise about done. I could tell you a ton more stories, but like I say, the stories are all out there, and there's lots of evidence of a lot of them. It's just a matter of, what you can pick up, what you can find. I have people tell me frequently when we go out, we'll go out looking at things. We've gone to some ancient burial sites. I told you about a guy that had a nuclear machine. He'd got his material from a nuclear warhead to build his machinery. It picked up the gold and it could tell the difference in frequency, similar to a metal detector. It could tell the difference between processed gold, meaning smelted and so forth, and refined versus raw gold. And so we would pick up burials, and he could tell if there was jewelry with processed gold jewelry in the graves, and that with this machine, and that's what we were doing. It was down in central Utah, and we found some burial mounds, and we were mapping burials. And so there were two mounds, and they were close to half-mile apart, and we were out in the desert. And so we went on the one, and we mapped all the graves and the burials using this machine, and the gold in the graves. And then everybody says, okay, there's the other burial over there. We're going to go over and map those. And everybody took off for this other burial mound. And I got there about a half hour after everybody else. And when I got over there, they were about done already. And they says, how come it took you so long to get over there? And I says, well, did you see all the points out in the desert there that were man-made? And they said, what are you talking about? And I says, come over here and look. And I take them over to some little rock cairns or individual rocks and say, stand right there and look down this way and tell me what you see. And they would be lines of rocks out in the desert that line up perfectly. And some of them would be little cairns with 5 or 6 rocks. Some would be single rocks, but they would line up perfectly. There weren't any other rocks around. You could set a transit on them and look down these lines of rocks, and then I'd say, now look behind us, the same direction. They'd look and say, well, there's no more rocks going that way. And I'd say, yeah, now go about a 30-degree angle, look down this way. And then they'd see a whole bunch of lines of them. Some of them were cemented together and so forth. And my suspicion is they could be star charts or something like that out in the desert, but they're definitely man-made lines of these rocks. And they said, well, how did you know those were there? And I says, I didn't, but it's the same thing I get asked by a lot of people. I say, how do you find all this stuff? Because I find stuff all the time out in the mountains. And I said, because I'm looking for it. I says, you go out deer hunting, you're looking for elk prints or deer prints or game trails or a watering hole or whatever, and you find what you're looking for. If you're not looking for this stuff, you'll walk right over the top of it. And that's really true. I know where there's big Indian burial grounds, and people will hunt through it, hundreds and hundreds of graves, and they won't know they walked through an Indian burial ground. There's lots of sign of it and so forth. And so people see what they're looking for. And I tell people, if you want to get into the hobby or profession or whatever you want to call it, of treasure hunting or history hunting or whatever, you have to look for those things when you're out there, and you'll find stuff everywhere. I go out on people give me a lot of stories and clues, and I'll go out looking for stuff. More times than not, I never find what I'm looking for, but I always find something. It's not what I'm looking for. Usually it's some other thing, but I always find stuff when I go out. It's everywhere. So I just tell people, if you're interested in it, keep your eyes open, look for everything, anything unusual, those kinds of things, and then check everything out. You'll find stuff everywhere you go. But, like I say, I've got a lot of stories. I still wrestling with whether to publish stuff or not, those kinds of things. But a lot of great stories of some fantastic things here in the state of Utah. There's lots of it. We could talk all night about ancient stuff that's really old, all the burial sites and tombs and things in central Utah and different places. But hopefully that gives you a little bit more to keep you interested in the hobby and keep looking for stuff. I find that even when you get kind of the secret stuff that you're working on, that you've got some really good clues on and so forth, that it's nearly always helpful if you can trust somebody enough to bring a few people in to help you with things. Multiple sets of eyes are better than one. In my opinion, you don't want to be too far out in the boonies all by yourself, being a hermit and trying to open up some mine or something. If something goes wrong, they're never going to find you, kind of thing. And that, so get a little help from your friends. Get somebody you can trust on things, do some of that. Like I say, sometimes a majority of my stories I'll share what I have with people. There's only a few that I keep something secret from, just because of what they are. But I've got way too many. I know that I can't get to everything now in my life, in my lifetime, with the clues I have and the stories I have and so forth and so I need to do something with it, pass it on. That's just like my story about the mine up White Rocks and that. People say, well, why don't you go find it yourself? Well, first of all, I would question whether anybody here, if they found one, would mine it themselves anyway. If you haven't ever tried to go out and try to dig a hole in solid rock or something, it ain't easy. And the older you get, the harder it is. And so there are a couple of people here in Utah that they go around, find them, and what do they do with them? Put them up on eBay or whatever, and they sell them, and they make really good money doing it, but they're not trying to mine it themselves. Anybody that thinks they can hard rock mine themselves or something, you're looking for a hard life, I'll tell you, even if you get something out of it. A little placer gold work or something like that, you can do a little bit of that kind of thing yourself or something, but some of these other things, you're talking big mining operations, you can't do it yourself. And so it's fun to look and find or even get the stories. There'd be value to finding it yourself, but if you got a whole bunch of stories, you got to pick and choose what you're going to spend your time on, and that's all you can do. Questions from anybody?
I can't.
Lots of questions.
Last one.
Go ahead. Think of one you want to know.
So
Not that I can
if,
tell you, but
I mean, let's say somebody were to find the mine of lost souls, what would you do with that? Would you lay claim to it, try to work it? Would you try to put it to historical value?
talking to me personally, I don't claim to I know more than the average person on antiquity laws, mining claim laws, things like that, but I'm certainly not an expert on any of them. From what I can see, if you actually find something like that, there's several things you can do. Myself personally, I would probably at that point try to get find out if it's even available. Number one, for claim, if it's already got a claim on the area, those kinds of things, and get a claim on it potentially. Once you have a claim on it, you can't keep a claim very long unless you're actively working the mine and showing that it's productive, all those kind of things. And so you either have to start doing something yourself every year to keep that patent on the mine and so forth, or you need to sell it to somebody or something. And I'll guarantee you, if you've got a good claim, there's a lot of people out there that like to buy it from you. And historically, that's happened all the time. You read about Park City, and that a lot of guys sold claims for thousands of dollars, which in those times was huge amounts of money, and then they turned around and mined it and made $10 million or something, But
Yeah, check with Corey Schumann. Did you have any of these?
yeah,
He's pretty
yeah.
good at that.
Corey's really made some good money doing it, and so it can be done. I mean, you can make some money off from it. And if you're the type of person that goes away and finds out somebody got $1 million out of the thing you sold for $1,000, you'll probably lead an unhappy life the rest of your life. But if you go away saying, I made $1,000, that's a pretty good deal, it can be all right. And I'm just saying, I'm not saying you're just going to get $1,000, but I'm saying if you found something worthwhile, there's lots of ways to get rid of that. You just have to be a little bit careful. If you know anything about Mel Fisher, he was in Utah for a while before he died, looking for some of the Spanish stuff and that. I followed him from clear back in the 60s. Used to read everything I could find about him, and he was looking for the Atoka, which he eventually found. That was the main thing he was looking for. He found a lot of other, and he was underwater treasure hunter mostly. Of course, he came here to Utah looking for Spanish stuff, but he would go find other smaller treasures, but he knew about the Atoka, and he looked for it for the majority of his life, and finally found it. The way he found it was a guy was looking in the archives and knew he was looking for it, and he told him to watch for the name and come up with any documents that he could find. Well, he found a document and gave it to him, and they'd been looking in the wrong place, and it took him almost immediately right to where they found some of the treasure. Well, when they break up in a hurricane and so forth, it can scatter for miles, and there's ways that you can figure out which direction it's breaking up, and you can follow that. It took him years and years and years and years to start finding different bolts of the treasure as they went along. Well, at the beginning, when I was reading clear back in the 60s, when the first shipload of treasure came in, the government met them at the dock, confiscated everything they found, the cannons, the gold, everything. They emptied a jailhouse and they filled it up with treasure from him. He fought for years, spent $500 million on attorney fees, and finally won the case. Is what happened is you have state waters that go out so far, federal waters that go out further, and then it's anybody's game. He found it outside all those waters, but it's such a rich treasure, both governments extended their water out to contain it and said that's our treasure. It's found in state waters, it's found in federal waters. And they started fighting over the treasure, who was going to get in the state of the federal government. It cost him over $500 million to win his lawsuit, that it was his gold, but it lost $500 million of it.
Did Spain jump in on that?
Courts. And they still ended up with a bunch. I mean, it was a huge amount. But the concept being there are attorneys out there that specialize, all these kind of things. You got to get your act straight, or there's a lot of people who take advantage of you. Besides there being a lot of straight people out there that can deal with it, you got to figure out who they are and those kind of things if you're going to try to do something with that. Now, if you find gold bars and things like that, typically you're talking Antiquities Act. And it used to be that anything over 100 years old you couldn't touch. The government's got more greedy now. It's anything over 50 years old. So nobody touched me after this meeting tonight because you could go to federal penitentiary for Antiquities Act. So, yeah. So there's a lot of things connected in that. You got to even be careful if you find things, even on leaving it there and telling the authorities. You don't want to touch it. Once you've touched it, you're in violation of the law, even if you put it back and things like that, if they can prove you've touched it. Do all of you remember a story here a couple of years ago about a kid down in
Delta?
Yeah, down in Delta, finding the big stash of gold bars from the Calvary?
Yep.
Okay, you want to hear the rest of Paul Harvey, the rest of the story on that one? Okay, so one of the building contractors that I work with, Buffalo Builders, he was building there in Morgan, and I got talking to him right when this happened. Now, it was their number one topic on all of our news stations here in Utah. They all told slightly different stories, but the basic story was this kid went out into the West Desert out of Delta, and he found this huge stash of gold bars. Had Calvary symbols stamped in the gold bars. There was old dynamite that was sweating and going to blow up. There was all these different things, but this huge gold treasure, and everybody went crazy over this thing. Well, basically, the way the story pans out is, number one, it's all covered by the Antiquities Act. He couldn't do anything with it. That all belonged to the government, and they just sent it on immediately. And we're going to throw you in prison, and you got to show us where it's all at. But all the nuts come out of the woodwork too. Their families getting phone calls threatening their lives. This happens frequently with all these kind of things. All kinds of things supposedly were happening. They had a few news follow-ups and that, but all this stuff was going on. So I start talking to this guy who was his very best friend. They could have been brothers all through school, through high school and everything. They lived at each other's houses. They stayed together the whole time. He was a builder, building a house up there. Well, his parents still live in Delta, and so he's going home it happened just before Thanksgiving. Came out in the news, and he's going home for Thanksgiving to his parents' house. And so I find out he knows this kid really good and everything. I says, okay, they quieted up now, everything. And I says, you need to go visit him when you're home with your mother and get the true scoop on what's going on in that. So he went over to the kid's house, didn't meet with him. He wasn't there, but met with his father and had a big discussion about it. And his dad said the whole thing was a made-up story. So now, that's probably is the truth. However, one of the best ways to start getting the government off your back and everything is because they're going to say, we're going to send you to prison. You found all this stuff and it's ours and you need to give it to us. And if you touched it, they'll search your property and everything. If you brought one home and they find it, you're already guilty. You're already federal offense and everything if they can prove you even touched it. So So you don't want to bring one home or anything if you're going to go through that, because as soon as they find it on your property, that you're guilty felonies and stuff with antiquity acts and so forth. But I question it right from the beginning, because number one, why would the Calvary have a bunch of gold with Calvary stamps in the gold? What does the Calvary do with millions of dollars worth of gold that belongs to the Calvary? They have their stamp in. You're lucky if you can get a couple of dollar paycheck or something. The Calvary doesn't have any money. They were poor military back then. Somebody else may have had money, gold bars that the Calvary was transporting, but it wouldn't have Calvary symbols on it, which was expressed in the news media. And there was too many other problems. And the way they ended the story was, he says he went out there and he saw black helicopters flying off with it all. Okay? That's what came out in the news after a while, not nearly as big as the fact that it found it, and then the father came out and said, no, the whole thing was fake, and he had to figure out some ways to kind of get out of the whole thing. They were getting threats from people, their family, and everything. And so, even if he found it, they come up with the story that, and so the federal government, if they can't find something, how do you get them off your back? Fell down and hit my head. I can't remember anything. I don't remember where I saw it.
Don't tell anybody to start with.
Yeah.
That's the moral of the
Yeah,
story.
and
Don't
that's
call it
basically
Fox
it. When
News.
people, it's just like those coins that were found in California not too long ago. Same thing. They come out and told everybody, and is what ended up getting that all taken away. They had a broker that was going to sell them all and everything, but they had one coin that was misstamped, and there was only one of those coins ever misstamped, and so they knew that they could trace the treasure exactly, and it was stolen. And so as soon as they showed that and talked about that one coin, they said, this is this robbery right here, and it's already been paid out by insurance company. That insurance company owns all that, so give it to them.
Yep, you should have one coin.
Yeah, one coin. And so if they hadn't mentioned anything or whatever, they could have sold all that stuff off. It's on their property and everything. They would have been okay. But it became evident with that one coin that it was owned by the insurance company who had paid the robbery off. And there was evidence of that because of one coin.
So if you would find a cache of silver or gold bars or whatever from the Spanish, first off, you don't say anything, but then what do? Cut it up and melt it down? Or? No, I mean, really.
You're asking me now how to be criminal about the whole thing, and what you're going to do.
I mean, honestly, it's an antiquity. You can't go around showing, I've got a Spanish bar here.
Okay, here's what I've told people, and they always tell me I'm crazy. So
First
I'll
of all,
tell
call
this
me.
in unison. You can all tell me I'm
We'll
crazy.
deal with it privately.
Okay, is what's happened nationally. Now, I'm not talking because it's way different in other countries, but in the United States, is what's happened historically is what's called finder fees, and it doesn't matter whether it was a robbery and the insurance company. If the insurance company still exists and they paid off a robbery, they own all of that. If it's found, it belongs to the insurance company forever if they're still in existence. Okay, and that's just one example. Other than that, antiquity laws and so forth, it will go, the government owns it and so forth, typically. Now, if it's on private property, there's other laws, but usually depending on what it is and how valuable it is, the government will change the laws on a second's notice so it's theirs, depending on how valuable it is and how much they want to have what you have found. And so, but historically, there's what's called finder fees, and there's no law, but it happens all the time with the government and other people, and it varies quite a bit, but as high, usually it's around 10 to 15%, sometimes as high as 20% would go to the finder. No law that says that, but that is typically what happens with insurance companies, everything else. And so is what I've said is don't touch it. If you find it, you don't touch it. But you go back, first thing you're going to do is get you a very good attorney that specializes in this kind of thing. Go find out who represented Mel Fisher for $500 million. Guarantee you they know a lot about treasure laws. Okay, you get somebody good to represent you, but you start letting the right people know that you found it. You're immediately going to get threatened by the government. We want it all. You'll be lucky if you don't go to prison for the rest of your life. Give it to us right now. Tell them go find it yourself, or even better, I fell down and bumped my head. My memory isn't very good, and I can't really remember very much anymore. I don't remember where it's at, things like that. And put it on their back. Go find it, and prove there's fingerprints on it, they're mine, whatever. And they can't do it. They're very greedy. They want all of it. And when you hold out, and they've got no evidence on you or anything like that, what's their choices if you're greedy? I'd a lot rather have 80% than 0%. And eventually they're going to come up with finder's fees. And if you find something that's worth $100 million and you only get 20% of it, guess what? I'm going to go away happy. And not only that, but you're not going to have to watch your back for the rest of your life, whether you get to go to prison. And they're not stupid. When you change from driving your '63 Volkswagen Bug around to driving your Maserati around, the government knows something's up.
That's when I got Al Capone.
And so if you want to walk away with a bunch of money, and not only that, but the government's crooked enough that I'll guarantee you that I'd have attorneys there, I'd have news media there, I'd have everybody sign agreements. And don't forget to tell them you want it tax-free. Otherwise, the second the deal's struck, they're going to take 80% of it or something for taxes. So you're going to work out the deal. I want 20%. I want it tax-free. We're going to have attorneys there. We're going to bring all the news media in. We're going to shake hands. We're going to have it all on TV, and so that you can't basically stab me in the back after things over. And I'm going to walk away with 20% or 15% or whatever was the best deal you can make with them, and you never have to look over your back again and actually have the money tax-free.
And then again, how many times you get searched leaving the U.S. on driving?
Well, I have people tell me all the time that's crazy. I
Go on
says,
through.
there are ways probably to get it out of the country and that, but unless you're willing to leave the country and never come back and visit family or anything like that, you better be careful because they're going to grab you. A good example would be here in Duchesne several years ago. There was 3 guys that did a scam. They bought a real Spanish finger bar. Now, by the way, I talked about big gold bars tonight. Usually they would do what's called buttons and finger bars. Finger bar, you go out to a creek or something that's with a sandbar, and you stick your finger down in the sand and pull it out, and that's your mold now to pour your molten gold in. Comes out shaped, that's why they call it a finger bar. Buttons, you just pour out little gobs of it, and it'd be kind of shaped like a shirt button or that of gold. And those were probably the most common kind that you could find. The reason being, they're real easy to shuffle in packs on donkeys and things like that. Determine how much that donkey can carry and shift from right side to left side, all those kind of things. When you have bars that weigh hundreds of pounds, it's really hard to balance loads and those kind of things and to carry them sometimes. So the finger bars were real popular. Well, these guys bought authentic Spanish finger bar, which you can find. You can buy them from Mel Fisher's group or different people. So they wanted to make sure that theirs looked really good, and then they cast their own. They cast several hundred out of copper, and then they gold plated them. And they had a whole bunch. They had hundreds of buttons, and they had hundreds of finger bars, all gold plated that they'd cast. Said they'd found a stash up here by Duchesne, and they sold them within a few days. They had tons. As soon as the word got out, everybody wanted to buy Spanish finger bars now. Well, if you do a spectral analysis, I don't know what they cost now. Years ago, they were about $1,000 to do a spectral analysis and run your chunk of metal through a machine, and it gives you a total readout on a piece of paper and tells you every mineral that's in there and what the percentages are. Well, that's about $1,000. The smallest of these finger bars sold for $1,000. That was the very smallest one, and they sold hundreds of them. And so if you bought a finger bar for $1,000, how many of you are going to go have a spectral analysis done on it for $1,000? Nobody is. And so they buy all this stuff and they put it in their safety deposit box. And so you've got all these people out there that buy these up. Some of them bought several of them. Some only bought one. You put them in your safety deposit box or whatever, and you're happy with your Spanish gold bars that you own and so forth. Well, the guy who was my boss, and you'll know, some of you will know his grandfather's name was J.C. Wilkinson. Is that name familiar to some of you? He's got a book out on Carrie Chenab. Okay, Well, that was his grandfather who bought several of the bars. His dad bought several of the bars. So we were talking about it one time. He was my boss, and he said, "Hey, so what he did was he told his father-in-law worked for one of the military contractors in Ogden Industrial Park, and they made aircraft parts for the military. Well, guess what? Your metals have to be exactly as described. They have to meet certain strengths and so forth. Very strict standard for the military to make parts for jet airplanes and fighters and things. And so guess what they have as part of their arsenal in the manufacturing company? They have a spectral analysis machine. And so when they order metals in from wherever, they run the metals through to make sure that they're being sold what they thought they were purchasing, and they can make these meet these structural standards for the military. And so he says, "Hey, Dad, you want to find out how pure your gold bars are?" He says, "I'll have my father-in-law run it through spectral analysis. It won't cost you $1,000. I can get it for free." He says, "Sure, I want to know." So he gives him the smallest bar that was sold for $1,000. He gives to him, and I had it in my possession for over 2 years. I was lecturing on different frauds, and that was one I was talking about. So we get the smallest gold bar, and they run a spectral analysis on it. It gives you a readout of everything in there. And when it said gold, guess what the percentage was? I can't remember exactly. I saw it, the piece of paper, but it's something like 0.00000746% or something like that. You get more gold out of a glass of water. And so as soon as they find out there's no gold in their bars, it was turned over to the sheriff in Duchesne County, and word got out immediately that it was a big fraud, that the gold, it wasn't really gold. The 3 guys bought an airplane and they went to Mexico. It took them 3 years to catch them one at a time because they came back to visit family, and that talking about whether you're going to skip the country and never come back. When you come back to get you, they got all three of them went to prison. I had the gold bar that sent them to prison in my possession for about 2 years. It didn't belong to me.
But they were being fraudulent. They didn't find that.
No, but
That sends
I
a
bring
whole
up that
nother-
story
sends
simply
up a whole
because is what
nother
I'm saying is unless you're planning on not coming back to the country, they can find out enough information. I won't say it happens every time.
My money will last a lot longer in a lot of other countries.
I'm just saying, if you're going to skip country, that's probably not a bad way to do it. But don't plan on coming back.
You can come see me.
So now we talked about all your illegal ways. Any other questions?
I can't. That the largest massacre that you talked about is that you mentioned that all the gold bars they just threw down into the choke cherries or whatever the bushes. Have those been all found?
Not that I know of. I suspect if I walked over there 100 yards off the road and kicked about half-inch of dirt that's collected over a few hundred years, that there's a whole stack of gold bars right there where they showed.
That would probably be the easiest one to go find, I think.
There's a bunch of other ones. I've got stories to quite a few, and I've got information to quite a few large stashes of gold. There's big stashes around. There's been some found. And I've got a lot of stories about both gold and silver bars being taken out of lakes and different things. And there's a lot of stuff around. Most of Rock Creek is reservation. In fact, there's a movement right now by the tribe to totally eliminate all white people from ever going through Rock Creek anymore.
So White Rock. This area.
White Rock's the lower part is owned by the Indians, but not the upper part.
The lower part.
Well, I don't know. It might be on reservation. It may not. It depends on where it's at.
Part of it's off.
Yeah. Other than, he may have had a fishing license from the tribal, and he may not have ever been able to do anything with it anyway, but I don't know.
So is where that massacre happened, is that off limits?
That is on tribal ground.
I guess we don't go there.
I know enough stuff about things on tribal ground. I'm waiting for it to be totally disbanded. If we can just absorb them into being U.S. citizens and no more tribal ground, You're going to see me buying my island in the Bahamas real quick after that.
They'd have to be real stupid to get that right.
Well, they don't have to give it up. We just do like putting them on the reservation, just so you don't have a reservation anymore. We're good at that.
That may be coming.
So, any other questions? All right, that's it. We got a whole lot of other stories some other time probably, but
So you never answered the question. What's your thoughts on that? 1600?
okay. And his question is a period of time being abandoned by the Spanish. There's a lot of stuff out there that Spanish were up there for about 300 years. You get into the diaries. If you take a class on Utah history, they'll tell you the very first white man in the state of Utah was Escalante crossing the Father. We know that's totally garbage, and it's part of one of many government cover-ups on things. I can't understand why they even print that. There's so much evidence. You get into Escalante's, that particular expedition, reading his scribe's day-to-day diary, which I've got parts of, where they talk about it, and the scribe says we're traveling on an ancient highway, and we've got not just the Spaniards, but we've got everybody else in here you can possibly imagine. By the way, one of the latest things I'm working on, I didn't tell you all the stuff we're working on just in the last year, but one of them, and Sean, I think you saw it, met up in the powwow on that when Vern came around with the pictures with the Egyptian symbols on it. You didn't see those?
We can just see those.
Okay, anyway,
Oh yeah, you too.
there's three sets of Egyptian writing within about a 10-mile range or less on the Wasatch Front that I've been able to collect information on and talk to people who found them and that in the last several years. And that's just one example. There's some ruins up on the side of the mountain that have stones set in on the inside with Egyptian writing. There's something similar to a sarcophagus that was found over by North Ogden Divide by a group of Boy Scouts here a couple of years ago. And now this new one that we just found out about just about a month ago up at the Morgan Powwow, he brought photos that some guys horse riding just found, and they told me about where that's at. I've got to hike up and photograph it. But he had Xerox copies of it, another set of Egyptian writing. Anyway, and then we've got a guy that's, we've had talk a couple of times up at Morgan Powwow that they found, they've been harvesting treasure right there by Centerville for a number of years now. We've had archaeologists up behind locked doors. We do luncheons with archaeologists from some of the universities and that, and he brings up several hundred coins, swords, great big crystals. The coins date back to 300 BC. That's being harvested over by Centerville.
What kind of coins?
What's that?
What culture?
Kind of mixed, which is a little confusing, but at the same time, it's just like Spanish. I have people say, well, this guy found a Spanish treasure, but I'm an expert on swords, and this isn't a Spanish sword. Well, that's stupid, because the Spanish were great sellers, and everywhere they'd stop, if they found a better sword, they'd buy it from them. They'd trade stuff and that. So they could have had swords from any country. Same thing with coins. When they got paid, they didn't always get paid with Spanish coins. It would be a mixture of coins.
Correct. And that's like I was having this conversation with Robert yesterday about that the Spanish real was considered legal tender in the United States until 1853. And so it was, gold and silver, still gold and silver, regardless of who stamped it.
And
So it could get dropped by anybody.
So a lot of times when people say, well, that story's bogus or whatever and all that kind of stuff, they haven't done any research. They don't understand a lot of those things. And I certainly don't claim to be an expert. I guess it depends on your definition of expert. I don't think of myself as an expert because there's always way more to learn than what I know right now. But the fact of the matter is a lot of those things are hard to track for that reason, because of trade and all those other things. You don't know what group left in there. And they've said, well, we think it was Knights Templar and things like that. And I go, Knights Templar didn't exist 300 BC, and all it, and you get all these stupid things that come in. And I'll guarantee you find them in published books, you find all this stuff, and you go, you got to sit down and use a little bit of common sense. Some of this stuff is just garbage. And whether they found something or not, the facts just don't back up in the story. The story the facts of the story might be accurate. The story itself is inaccurate, and a lot of people just don't give it much thought on what it could possibly be in that. But there's
Well, it's frame of mind of interpretation too, like religious people walking by religious objects.
well, and I can tell you for sure, and I'm LDS, but tons and tons of stuff found in Utah all tie in with the Book of Mormon. Not so. If you do a little bit of research on that, it's not hard to determine. Some of it does, I think, but a lot of it does not. But it's wishful thinking. When you say religious treasures, a lot of times it's a religious treasure because you want it to be a religious treasure, or you want it to be whatever, and so that's the way the story evolves. Is it's what I want it to be, but that oftentimes is not the case. And you have,
Let's stand in front of those petroglyphs you're looking at today. Ask every person the same question. You're going to get a different answer.
Sure.
What's that saying? What's that picture?
And the advantage to something like we did down at Sadie's was having the gal come in there who's had a number of Indian shaman and different people come in and say this is what it is, and good chance that it's better chance getting that kind of answer than something else. Doesn't necessarily mean hundreds or thousands of years later he knew for sure what it was, but I'd trust that a whole lot more than John Doe that goes up there and says this is what it is.
The area that they had up above Centerville, I heard Centerville, Farmington area, most of the stuff that I had heard about on that thing, I don't know if that's to ask you that question, was it above the shoreline of the watermark of the old Lake Bonville? Or are you willing
You
to say
guys at
that?
some point are going to want to go to sleep. Let me tell you a little bit more that will kind of answer that question. Okay, because this comes up frequently, Lake Bonneville, and if I ask people from here in Utah or anybody that knows about Utah, and I say, okay, here's our test. What can you tell them about Lake Bonneville? How long did it exist here? Here's our test question. What is that? How long?
And when did it go away?
What's that?
And when did it go away?
They can kind of tell you when it went away.
They can kind of.
But how long was it here before it went away? Long time, but what's a long time? People say, well, basically, best way to describe it is always here. Okay, University of Utah. And I don't know if this is still available. I bought the book many years ago from them. University of Utah Press, with their archaeology department, printed a great big book, Hogup Cave. Hogup Cave's on the west side of the Great Salt Lake over towards the north end. And in the book, one of the most fascinating parts of the book, and I talked to people who are dead now, but some of the old timers that I knew that used to fly their airplanes over when there was bounty on coyotes, and that they used to fly over there, especially after they got first snow inch deep. They'd have somebody riding the passenger side of their planes. There were 7 guys that were all buddies, and they'd fly over there. One would have his rifle, and they'd fly looking for coyote tracks in the fresh snow, and then they'd follow them, they'd shoot the coyotes, and you could land and cut their ears off and their tail, different things that are required for bounty, and you could get bounty on them, and they'd go over there and hunt coyotes. And so a lot of stuff over on that side, a lot of big Indian battles. The Basque sheep herders over there would show the one guy I knew that spoke French. He'd go over and the Basque, because they'd never seen anybody, would be thrilled to see him, and they'd cook dinner for him. They'd sit and talk. He learned how to speak French in the war. And he says it'd show them the human skulls with the arrowheads stuck in the skulls and things from the big battles. And they'd have coffee cans full of arrowheads and stuff over there. And there's micro petroglyphs, and there's all kinds of neat stuff over there, but some of the antelope traps still exist over there, and different things. But Hogup Cave, he told me, you went in Hogup Cave and you had to get on your belly and wiggle in there like a worm, and you'd go back there. It didn't go back in very far. You'd go back in there 20, 30, 40 feet, and you'd always worry about, and I've done this myself, you always worry about whether you're going to come nose to nose with a porcupine or a skunk or something. But he'd be wiggling back in the hole, and he says, I went back in there before they excavated. Well, University of Utah came out and excavated that cave. And the cave, when they got it all excavated, is like 50, 60 feet high in the entrance. And he's wiggling in on his belly. Now, it's a great big cave up there on the mountain. And so one of the most interesting points in the book they took a vertical cut as they were excavating the cave out, and like reading tree rings to tell how old a tree is, you see all these thousands of lines of sediment coming in, and as they get better and better at it, they could read a lot of that, kind of similar to reading tree rings to determine different ages and when different sediment fell in there. Well, as they did a vertical cut, you can look all over in this vertical cut that's about 60 feet high, and you can see fire ring, nets for when the Great Salt Lake was freshwater. They're using fish nets, games, arrowheads, all kinds of things. And you come down through all these thousands of little tiny 32nd of an inch or whatever little lines of sediment coming in, and all of a sudden there's about an 8-foot wide band in the middle of it. Guess what that was? It was Lake Bonville. Then underneath it, thousands of bands with fire pits, games, nets, things like that. That cave was occupied before Lake Bonville, and it was occupied after Lake Bonville. And so for people saying it always existed there or anything, and so you might start tying into your Cibola and all these kind of things, the 7 cities of gold, all kinds of things supposedly happened up around the Great Salt Lake according to a lot of the Indian legends and so forth. Maybe, maybe not. I mean, it's a lot of things to think about, but the Indians were up around Great Salt Lake and that before Lake Bonville existed, and there's good evidence of it, and they were there for a long time after Lake Bonville. They talk about the possibility of the Aztecs and different people coming from up around the Great Salt Lake, finally migrating down, maybe through Chaco and different places, and then leaving that during drought, and finally ended up in South America and that. And I'm not going to say either way. I don't know enough about it to say yay or nay, but I do know that there have been Indians in there for a long, long, long time.
When did the Spanish finally leave the Utah area? Were they here in the 1820s and 30s?
The Spanish were here when the Mormons were here.
Were they?
Still, you bet.
Well, they're heading out.
Yeah, that is what happened because their mining and everything depended on slave trade. And they didn't get all the slaves from the Utes. They brought a lot of men in that, but the sheriffs and so forth that were being assigned when the pioneers got here would intercept big trains of donkeys and that coming down Spanish Fork Canyon, and they'd stop and rest their mules for a couple of days because it'd be weighted down so much with gold and ore and stuff. And they'd come down and make them release all their slaves and tell them if they ever came back, they'd throw them in jail and a bunch of stuff. And so they were still in here when the pioneers were here.
And are there journals that talk about that?
Yeah, there are. And that, not only that, and some of you, here's another story. One of the he's not a contractor, he's an owner builder. So in the building trades, as a building official, homeowners can build their own house if they're going to live in it, and they can do all the work, them and their immediate blood relatives, without being licensed by the state of Utah and all this kind of thing. And so I get these, we call them owner builders. They come in and say, I'm going to build my own house or whatever. Well, I've got one right now building a huge house up in Mountain Green. And it just so happens that his wife's family, and this is now about 3 generations old, and some of you probably heard about this, and I still somewhere, I've got magazines that date back in the mid-1800s, and that archaeology magazines. A lot of the stuff's long since been destroyed and gone all over the U.S., and I've collected boxes and boxes of these things and different archaeological reports from societies back in the 1800s, early 1900s, and so forth. But I've still got some of the articles out of some of the treasure hunting magazines, where one article in particular that starts out showing it's a bone map that's circular, and it shows something like 17 gold mines here in Utah or something that's found in a Spanish mine. Well, it's over in, what's the name of the town right there by Heber?
Wallsburg.
Yeah, Wallsburg. Okay, so if you head from Heber down to Provo, and there's a turnout to go into Wallsburg there, well, it's this kid's wife's family, and so he's given me a lot of information, and they've kept a journal from day one and photographs and that, and he's in the process of getting that journal for me and letting me read it, hopefully, and take photographs and all that kind of stuff. But there's been a few stories published and one thing or another, but the story I was told just recently by the family is that his great grandfather, I think it was, met a Spanish guy who had on a leather map had a map to this really good Spanish mine, and he let him look at it quite a while, but he wouldn't let him keep it or draw a picture of it or anything. But he retained it in his mind enough that once the Spanish guy taking the map was gone, he redrew the map. Well, he used the map to find the mine, and he went up to Wallsburg, and there was a tree, and the man's got a photograph. The tree's gone now, but they cut it off, and there's about 10 guys standing on the stump at the same time. It was a huge tree, and that was a marker tree or monument tree on the map to tell you basically you were there. And so once they found this huge tree that stood out because it was so much bigger than any of the other trees around, then they went up in the oak brush real close to it, and then you could find the steps carved out of the rock. They followed that up. There's, trying to remember how many entrances he told me. There's 3 or 4 entrances into the mine, and then once you go inside, there's 7 shafts. And he told me he went back in there one time, quite a ways until he started to get scared that there'd been some cave-ins and stuff, and so he decided to come back out. And I'm envisioning him going back in 100 yards or so, and I says, well, how long were you in the cave? And he says, 7 hours. And I says, how far back did you go? And he says, oh, probably, I don't know, mile or something back in, this is a mine, a Spanish mine. And there's 7 other shafts in the mine. That's only one of them. But when they went back in, they found these bone maps, they found buffalo skulls, they found all kinds of things. And I'm thinking 3 generations old. And I says, so is there still good veins of gold in that? He says, we don't know. We've never dug all the sediment out. Now, this again, if you have a good mine, not only would they throw the miners potentially in and just cover the front and then eliminate all the tailings, they'd fill in the whole mine. That may take, as big as this thing is, and it's filled clear up, 7 shafts, and in 3 generations they haven't been able to dig to the back of any of them to see. But in order for it to be filled like that, it was filled because the Indians don't want to be slaves in it anymore. It's got to have huge amounts of gold or whatever it is they're mining in there to take that amount of labor to fill all 7 of those shafts back in. So
there are journals, and the Spanish were here still.
And people will say, well, they weren't to Utah, and then they'll finally agree, well, yeah, they were in Utah. There's evidence of them going up into Idaho. They went quite a bit further north than Utah also. But
What was that Chicken Creek Massacre? That's Rhodes went down, found that map or that waybill. So they were obviously here.
Yeah. Well, there's lots of evidence of them being here. I think that anybody that says they weren't here hasn't done any research at all. There's lots of evidence of them being here.
What do you think about more privateers though instead of official Spanish, where your symbols all start to change the further north you get?
Well, the mines had to be registered with the King of Spain to be legal. If they were
To be
Spanish
legal.
mines.
That's
To
what
be
I'm saying.
legal.
Privateers more though.
And one of the ways you tell, one of the symbols, and again, I'm not going to swear by any of these because I question where people come up with their information, but from several different sources, one of the ways you can tell is at the mine site you'll find a large heart carved. The heart carved means that it's registered with the King of Spain and he gets the royal fifth. So a fifth of everything that's coming out of the mine goes to the King of Spain. And so that's one of many symbols you'll find if it's a registered mine. But you take the Atoka or any of these, even that are carrying, if you look at the bars, and if Dell were here and he's got like real Spanish silver bars taken off Hoyt's Peak and so forth. And if you look at those, they have a whole bunch of stamps on all the bars, and one will be the miner, and one will be the assay person that took an actual assay on it, and they'll have all kinds of different people that are putting their expertise stamp on. There'll be dates, all kinds of things, and there'll be a stamp on there that shows that the royal fifth was paid on that bar. And when they go down on these shipwrecks and that, and bring up all the gold and that, whether you're talking to Mel Fisher, who's dead now, or whether you're talking to some of these other professional underwater treasure hunters, they typically will bring up more gold that doesn't have the stamps on it than the gold with the stamps, meaning more than half their cargo was illegal treasure because it's never taxed. And so more than half your miners out here were not sanctioned by the King of
Well,
Spain.
you got a bunch of people that aren't miners here. Blacksmiths. It's like when they keep finding these massacres, they find a lot of civilians mixed in. A few fighters. Got the army, got the stuff. But the rest of them are, just street clothes.
Well, it's not a whole lot different than if you're mining today. You've got to have a lot more than miners working for you if you run a big operation. Okay, any other questions? Kept you up a long time. Okay, that's it. Have a good night's sleep.